分钟后开始，请大家赶紧入座。各位贵宾，我们的国家语言发展会议即将在2分钟之后开始，请大家尽速入座，非常感谢。 各位贵宾，我们第3届国家语言发展会议即将开始，请大家尽速入座。咱第3届国家语言发展会议特别开始，请大家赶紧入座，非常感谢。 你好，萨利嘎嘎马布隆，大家好，大家好，大家好，各位现场贵宾、线上好朋友，很荣幸与各位齐聚一堂，共同来关心也见证台湾国家语言的发展。感谢所有的好朋友一起在现场，还有我们的线上好朋友一同来参加我们第3届的国家语言发展会议。那么首先，我们以热烈掌声欢迎今天的开场表演团体马祖戏剧团，掌声欢迎。 马祖戏剧团呢，在2016年成立，是一支由马祖在地公教人员与社区民众组成的素人剧团。他们坚持以全闽东语马玉娃来演出，实践用家乡的故事演马祖的戏。剧团代表作是《马祖心情记事》系列音乐剧，将海岛的渔业岁月、战地的军管记忆以及本梦夜间摆设。 这个祭祀酬神的珍贵文化搬上舞台，再次热烈掌声欢迎马祖戏剧团。这路比拉过。
免开免用的，多千里五海回来，我想拍球海里巴勇，我听到拍友你喝了。
为谁丢丢满载理想
我哈前紧紧伊美酒，我黑龙个黑龙当龙，我叫尾看好龙，伊给伊拍友好了。
为谁心因有亮丽相依？对你我天地啊，都送侬侬不落错。相爱相依，多紧紧打地里用，我请问可安你东西，都好嘞见面你海风，为怎就怕有你月亮？你是有几多错的相依？
最谁为出血就听眼里，怕有你喝了。
再一次感谢马祖戏剧团，他们用马幼娃作为载体，将深厚的文化底蕴把马祖带向台湾本岛以及国际。再一次谢谢马祖戏剧团的演出。
我们现场的各位贵宾、各位长官、各位好朋友，我们在8月29号在桃园展演中心有一场下午的2点半有一场趴 U 的音乐剧的演出，这是唯一一组全台湾以闽东语来发声的一个音乐剧。欢迎现场所有的贵宾长官们一起莅临来给我们指导，谢谢大家，谢谢。
欢迎欢迎。
非常感谢马祖戏剧团精彩的演出，我们要用马祖语谢谢他们，下俩。非常感谢国家语言发展法在2019年1月9日经总统公布施行，另于同年7月9日完成国家语言发展法施行细则发布施行，保障台湾各固有族群之自然语言和台湾手语的传承复振以及发展。为了研议以及推展国家语言事务，依照国家语言发展法第5条以及该法施行细则第4条规定，政府应该定期召开国家语言发展会议。文化部我们在2021年召开首届的国家语言发展会议，2024年整合出政策方向以及具体的目标。今年再度召开第3届的国家语言发展会议。那么这次会议的主题是共创语言平权的多语社会，积极探讨如何在公共政策、教育推动以及社会参与落实语言平权，营造尊重多语、共荣共存的社会环境，进而促进各个族群语言的永续发展，为台湾迈向多语社会奠定坚实的基础。那么今天呢，在场有许多贵宾一起来到我们的国家语言发展会议的现场，我们邀请到介绍的贵宾站起来跟大家挥挥手。 首先，咱们来欢迎是咱的文化部部长李远部长，我们欢迎文化部李远部长，你向他邀请文化部李远部长。非常感谢，非常感谢。接下来，你向他邀请客家语言会主任委员顾秀飞主任委员发言。非常感谢。接下来，咱们来欢迎的是教育部政务处长劳国委政务处长，我们欢迎教育部政务次长刘国伟次长，非常感谢。接下来我们要欢迎的是原住民族委员会副主任委员杜张梅庄副主委，非常欢迎。再来，咱们来邀请的是立法委员柯中信立法委员，非常感谢。继续，咱们来邀请的是财团法人关怀文教基金会董事长周清玉董事长，非常感谢。Let's welcome our distinguished guests from 前联合国少数族群问题报告员 Fernand de Varennes 教授。Let's welcome, bienvenue. Also, let's welcome Nancy Hornberger 美国宾州大学教育学院荣誉退休教授。Let's welcome. 那么要关心足侪国家语言发展重要人士甲专家学者，非常感谢您的参与。所以，咱们继续来介绍的是咱管旗政府的代表。我们来介绍的是连江县政府文化处处长吴小云处长。所以，咱们继续来邀请咱台南市文化局副局长林伟旭副局长，非常感谢。也有咱济济管旗政府的代表，嘛感谢咱台南国家美术馆提供这回咱的场地来做国家语言会议的场所。接下来我们就要欢迎我们的长官贵宾来一一致辞了。首先，我们来欢迎的是客家委员会古秀飞主任委员，你向他邀请客家语言会古秀飞主任委员。
各位关心语言发展的伙伴们，大家好，我好，马里马萨鲁，我说上来以前我跟原民会的副主委讲说我要比你先讲那因为每次在他讲之后大家开怀大笑，后面讲的就会很紧张，因为我要讲的通常都是很严肃哈维菲成立20年来跟大家报告过去一段时间过去一段时间客家人規模痴心咁嘛規模也係沙菲 TV， 故所提沙菲地位舉手表現出自己係客家人的身份，也唔敢承認不敢承認也係過去一段時間。後來客委會成立嘅客家委員會，透過幾多嘅政策、幾多嘅法通，來同大家、來同社會講，一件事客家提喺社會嘅貢獻，客家提喺社會嘅 TV， 一下客家人會企出來，會願意承認嘅。我用一個數字跟大家報告，提100年的時間2011年100年的民國100年的時間，我們客委會的調查，客家人在台灣的人口數大概410多萬，410萬在105年的時候大概有450幾萬，提110年的時候，每5年做100，110年的時間。有767萬，可見這個客家人口數是一直增長，硬成長。那代表什麼？代表認同，代表有認同，但是也係好現象，代表作為一個也族群，伊唔是擔心那同時過去一段時間不敢承認自己是這個族群的人的同時，當然。他也不敢講自己的話，唔敢講自己嘅話。也既然呢，安尼做下來，越來越多人會承認自己係客人。安尼看越來越多人承認，那等不等於用客語 来使用了呢？哈，我们再来看一下数据哈。共用100年的时间，客家人会用客家话来使用的哈，大概哈使用能力上44%到46%哈。那105年是多少呢？大概46.8啊。105年黑一度38，掉下来了。好，所以人口印度认同高了，但是他的语言能力是下降了。好，也是我们最有心的事情。好，全世界将一种语言希伯来语体死亡之后再复振，因为有强大的这个建国意识。那我们看以客家来说，那么强的认同，但是他的语言却下滑了。好，也是非常令人忧心的事情。哈，所以6年可以100台币，我們個希望當然係會提改革政策方面，唔管係法制上，或者是各種嘅計劃、活動、教學等等嘅運用上，各方面哈，來促進、來加強也語言的意識跟使用，然後，但是我們面對安尼現實的狀況，我們實在十分的擔心哈。也喺擔心之外啊，也有另外一個啦，研究有個幾負嘅事情，大家可應該攏知哈，就是黃仁勳來到台灣，面對幾位講英文的聲音呢，面對很會說英文的小孩，用河洛話母語講，你敢袂曉講台語？你敢袂曉講？你應該愛講台語。講這件事情也要網絡宣傳，這個事情不可能歸振奮，但是也讓我們很憂心，也讓我們覺得悲哀，各種各樣的複雜的情緒，所以我們想象的語言的復振比我們想象的還夠複雜，還夠困難，所以6年100也國家語言的發展的會議，希望透過大家的各種的方法建言，幫我們作為中央的行政單位，替各方的思考當中，做得更全面，做得更完整的來推出，某一方做得完全100%來達到也的效果的啦，只有全面的，所以最後我也有個期待啦，就黃仁勳一句話引起全台灣更多的重視這個語言的朋友們的也來討論。那2年後的我們的大會，是不是也可以邀請他來跟我們講一下，跨界一下？他在 AI 的場域，在科技的領域，那是他的專業，沒話說。來我們也在大會上，肯定可以給我們很大的信心。好，感謝大家。接下來呢，還是要跟大家共下努力來。為語言的復振，來上網答辯，感謝大家，祝福大家。
非常感謝客家會顧秀飛主任委員，非常感謝客委會顧秀飛主任委員。接着我們歡迎的是原住民族委員會杜張梅莊常務副主委，掌聲歡迎。
好，我們的文化部李部長，還有我們客委會的古主委還有教育部的劉次長，還有我們周前縣長還有我們許立委，因為剛剛主持人有一一的介紹，這邊就不一一的致意了哈。那還有我們理會的這邊所有參與的這個貴賓還有我們的這些對語言發展非常關心的朋友們，大家好，大家平安，沙寶馬干拉了。剛剛那個是盧凱宇哈。那很高興今天能夠代表原民會來參加這次第3屆的這個國家語言發展的會議哈。我想這次的主題是共創平權語言的多語社會哈，這個也充分的呈現了我們國家對於這個多元文化的尊重，還有我們這種語言多樣化的這種核心價值哈。我想語言對原住民族來講，我們的族語不單單是文化傳承的 工具，很重要的，它也是我们原住民族历史记忆的载体哈。那原住民族族语，我相信刚刚客委会有特别提到，他们的这个族语的这些发展的过程，还有一些使用上的一些情况。那其实，在原住民的语言上，更是面临了非常多的困境跟危机。我们这个濒临这濒危的语言哦，就有好几个族群哦，都是濒危的这个语言。能讲的不多哦，像刚客委会主委在那边侃侃而谈，讲真的，我没有办法像你这样子呢，因为我们的族语的非常流失的非常严重哦，我自己算是中高级通过哦，那还没有办法像你这样子侃侃而谈，非常羡慕，我还要再努力了哈。那当然，在面对这些困境跟危机的时候，原民会在未来有4个面向在持续的加强推动。第一个是我们持续的建置我们的这个语料库，来发展这个人工智慧。我们的这个原住民族语言发展基金会在去年也公布了这个所谓16族的 AI 的系统，就是针对族语的这个使用上，透过人工智慧来发展。那第二个部分是原民会也会在这个扎根在这个学龄前的这个族语的资源上投注更多的资源哈，在这个族语保姆跟这个族语沉浸式的幼儿园，我们会投入更多的这个经费，我们要抓住这个学习的黄金期哈。那第3个是开发多元的这个学习的这个教材。那我们事实上会里面在今年已经跟这个可爱巧虎岛的公司有授权我们哈。未来这一个动漫，会用族语的方式来呈现，希望透过这样的方式，能够让我们这个族语能够进入家庭，让家里面的人一同来透过这样的亲子的学习，来让他获得更大的效益。当然，最后一个就是我们希望能够培养这些年轻的专业人的族语推动的人才。我们都知道，现在族语的推动大部分都是比较年长哦，那我们也看到它的断层、它的危机，所以会里面也特别去弄了一些所谓的族语人才的培训计划，还有跟大专院校这个公费生的这个培训计划，都是希望说族语在未来，在我们原住民的这个传承上面能够生生不息，能够有更多的这个年轻人能够参与，让它能够更永续的这样的一个传承。那最后，当然在这个族语的这个政策的推动上，我们非常谢谢文化部、教育部哦给我们的长期的支持，跟这个协助。那另外也谢谢客委会在族语的政策推动上，也常常跟原民会做一些交流，也给我们很多的构思，跟我们很多的一些思想上，一些政策上该如何推动的一些意见，都谢谢你们了。我相信在这一个族语的推动上，我们更要感谢今天在座的很多第一线的族语的工作推动者，我们向你致上最高的敬意哈。最后是希望说，透过这样的一个这次的会议，透过这2天的交流，我相信要创造更好的许多的这个族语的发展的环境，让我们的族语在日常生活中能够自信、自由的永续传承。那最后我还是要用我们东卢凯语的族语来祝福这次的大会圆满成功，也祝福各位嘉宾平安、健康、喜乐。马拉嫩阿基多马斯基瓦亚纳，大吉拉盖基阿勒基勒达拉扎，爱索布鲁布鲁阿古大伊亚亚纳达，嘎苏里亚里瓦的。沙宝马尔拉能啊，谢谢大家，谢谢。
非常感谢原住民族委员会杜庄梅庄副主委为我们的勉励，也希望族语能够持续的传承。接下来我们邀请到的是教育部刘国伟政务次长，咱就来邀请教部劳国会政务处长给咱们的非常感谢，欢迎。
大家早。那个我们文化部李部长， 还有我们古主委，还有原民会的副主委，还有我们周县长，还有各位推动语文教育的本土语言教育的一些先进，哈嘎你呢？但是我爸爸每次会骂我的时候，都说我的客家话比我的英文还差。后来我想想，这个是包养还是讲哈？但是总觉得我们一直没有那个环境去学习，所以教育部在推动本土语言的时候，我们一直在想，你看我们周县长在我们那个本土语言推动，我们定期开会，我们都一直想说我们怎么去营造在校园内可以让我们的不同的族群、不同的人可以用他的母语去学习，去说他该说的语言。所以我们做的还不是很好，但是我们已经努力。像就以母语的沉浸幼稚园，刚才那个我们古主委还有我们的副主委都讲，还有我们周县长一直讲，那个母语一定要从小开始。我们现在已经将有400多所的幼稚园，用沉浸式的教学，不管是用客语或者是原住民语，甚至都可，或者是台语。那我们现在，我们周县长一直跟我们讲，不是推动而已，我们还要过去看他们有什么希望协助的，甚至我们会给予更多的支持。我们在推动上面，我们也在大专院校这边，我们客委会之间有办了我们办了10年的叫做台语跟客语的文学比赛，文学奖。以今年来说，我们有600多个非常漂亮的文学的参赛的，然后选出了53个作品。我觉得过去10年有更多这么优秀的年轻人，愿意在用他的母语表达我们的美丽的他们的故事，这也就是一个非常令人感动。我们会持续的去推动。所以那我们教育部也做了一件比较令人兴奋的事，大家很少知道。我们台语认证是教育部在负责，现阶段每年大概有3万多人来考试，通过率大概7%到8%。所以那这样就够了吗？我们去年创了全世界，应该是全台湾第一例，我们开拔到美国华盛顿首府，把我们的台语认证放到美国华府做了第一次，多么可难！而且第一次虽然只有20多个人来考试，通过率也有85%。那今年跟现场报告，我们要拓点，而且我们会继续去做，甚至我们教育部会把我们在驻组人员推动我们台语认证列为他们的年终考绩之一啊。我们在制度面，我们希望我们的所有教育部从制度面，我们积极去推动所有我们的母语的。如果客委会要推动你们国外的客语的认证我们可以跟着我们走但我们很愿意一起协助就是我们推动所有的本土语言，是我们真的是尽力的去做。我们很希望借由这2天的会议，各位先进来多给我们一些意见，告诉我们可以如何做得更好、更彻底。当然，现在教学现场真的很辛苦。那我们的政策是希望不要让我们教学现场增加老师的负担。虽然现在我们的108课纲每个孩子大概一周会有1小时的母语课程，那能不能继续推动，有它的实质上的优势跟劣势。我希望各位先进告诉教育部怎么样做的会更好，在让我们的母语的推动上面会有更精进的一些做法。那希望大家能继续支持我们，这是我们这个部会，我们会继续持续。那我们也会在嘉义，很快今年度会有一个沉浸式的台语基地。我们还在，这是官方第一个沉浸基地。我们希望成立以后，稍微有模型的时候，我们会去跟我们的周县长，它是民间版的台语基地。我们希望我们部里的立场就是，我们做好第一个，我们会希望能台湾各地方找一个适当地方去创造更多台语沉浸式的教学， 部长我们的部长的想法就是，孩子们能在那边过夜，就是到那边就是纯粹用台语去过生活、吃饭，还有学习。这就是我们希望，除了在幼稚园的沉浸式教学之外，我们更推广到甚至全民，我们全民教育都是如此。好，我们希望大家都一起努力。我愿祝这2天的会议顺利成功。再一次谢谢大家努力，谢谢。
非常感谢教育部老各位政务处长，非常感谢，非常感谢教育部刘国伟政务次长。接着我们要欢迎的是文化部部长李远部长，我们掌声欢迎李远部长。来，你恐哈邀请李远部长。
在场的来自政府还有民间的所有关心台湾语言发展的朋友，大家好。今天早上我去吃早饭的时候，发现在台南早上观光客很多，然后非常喧哗，非常快乐。我仔细一听，各种语言都在我耳边回荡。我忽然觉得我们已经活在一个多语言的社会，而且彼此也尊重。那我很高兴，这个3届的这个全国语言发展的会议，我参加2次。那上一次我坐在台下听台上的朋友讲话的时候，有一句话我到现在还记得，他说语言其实就是像呼吸一样这么简单。大家不要把语言弄得很复杂，语言就像呼吸一样。其实我也觉得语言就像食物一样，大家本来就活在一个自己所习惯的一个地方，呼吸着新鲜空气，吃着他习惯的食物。那有一天有个人问我说，为什么所有的语言都是国家语言之后，为什么还要加上国家2个字？就是既然所有的语言都可以讲，为什么要加上国家？那就是我们台湾的命运。我想大家都知道，台湾一直在寻找自己的语言。经过日本时代的时候，国语要讲日语；到了国民政府来之后，国语要讲华语。那有很多的族群活在一个同样的土地上，他好像迷路一样，找不到自己的家。他也很像流浪一样。明明是在自己的土地上，它就像流浪一样。所以我觉得语言其实是文化的一种最根本的一个元素。所以当我们政府开始把所有的语言都认为是国家语言的时候，它代表什么意义呢？它代表第一个，在文化上，台湾已经进入到一个多语言的社会。多语言也代表一种多样性。你在美国吃汉堡，汉堡只有1种；可是在台湾，不管任何一样，植物、蔬菜或者料理，它都可以很多种。这就是属于一种文化。另外，它也是一种国家的宣示，就是我们国家从过去有统一的语言，在日本时代只能讲日语是国语，在国民政府来台湾之后，只能讲一种是华语才是国家的语言。在我那个年代，每一部电影明明是原住民，明明是客家人，明明是台湾人，他讲的语言都一样，你会觉得很不自在。所以，当我们政府宣布把所有语言都变成这个国家语言的时候，它的意义其实是非常重大的。所以今天我很高兴来参加这样子一个第3次的国家语言这个大会，我觉得它是非常有意义的。就像台南的天空，台南的这个我们今天在现场的这个台南国家美术馆这么明亮。台湾经过一个非常混沌、黑暗的一个100年以后，我们终于找到我们自己的一个大家可以共同存在的一个土地，讲着自己习惯的语言，呼吸着自由的空气，吃着自己想吃的食物，我们终于得到一个完全新的社会。谢谢。
非常感谢部长给我们勉励，请部长先行回座。接着我们要请大家呢一起来进行大合照，为大家在第3届的国家语言发展会议留下完美珍贵的记录。 那么第一张照片呢，我们邀请大家先比个赞。好，1、2、3，看向前方，摄影师，1、2、3，金能3。好，第二张呢，我们拿起你的国家语言发展会议的手册。好，手册拿高高，把你的笑容也端出来，把你的笑容推出来哦。咱看向头前的摄影机，我们看向前方，摄影师，1、2、3，1、2、3。好，部长。我们给部长一下这个我们的会议手册，来，我们的教育部长。好，我们再次看向前方，我们拿出我们的手册，1、2、3。好，非常感谢，我们的开幕式就进行到这边。接下来，我们紧接着是我们的第一场的主题演讲。这个场次主持人是国立东华大学原住民民族学院族群关系与文化学系教授兼原住民族国际事务中心主任谢若兰主任，为我们带来这场演讲是加拿大人权学者、作家、倡议者 Fernand de Varennes 教授。今天他将以语言权利与民主社会建构共融性语言政策，促进全球稳定、繁荣与正义的重要意义进行第一场的主题演讲。接着，我们要感谢陈廷飞委员办公室的助理，以及林俊炫委员办公室助理，还有陈怡贞议员办公室助理，来到我们的国家语言发展会议的现场。我们这一次掌声献给我们的教授谢若兰主任以及 Fernand de Varennes 教授，掌声欢迎。现在我们就把时间交给我们的谢若兰教授。
大贝玛利亚瓦基第巴巴比达格罗麦。我刚才是用我西拉雅族的语言跟大家说早安。那我想刚才的这个开幕里面，我们已经有听到很多多元的语言。那我也想要展示一下我在台湾所学到的这个很基础的一些语言的问候。手语的早安，还有客家话大概早安。好，古主委哈，可以验证一下哈。那我们的周县长大概早安哈，早安。那我们的这个我不知道，我没有看到在场有没有这个阿美族哈。爱好萨利嘎嘎马布隆，还有我们刚才的杜章主委已经走掉哈，他是用东卢凯语的沙包哈。那我们的在座的这个主讲者哈，应该是用 Good morning Bonjour。早安哈，用法语跟他问候哈。那我想为什么我们今天伫遮哈要用一个这个开始，我想讲应该是用能介绍咱伫即马所在这个所在哈，台南甲咱的西拉雅在内的原住民族来问候哈。这是咱对这个在地一个足正当的这个问候哈。我想咱今仔日因为台南有一个足重要的所在，可能甲拄仔大家拢无提到，咱拢对国家的赞许。不过台南它是一个整个历史发展非常重要的地方，因为我们的语言里面西拉雅语所书写成的新港文书，其实是我们在台湾最早有文字的语言。那我们的这个西拉雅族在内的这个族群，在这边也孕育了很久。所以我也要借这个机会，在这一次的这个国家语言发展会议里面，向包含西拉雅族在内的所有的族人，还有我们所有不管在台湾各个民族在进行的语言复振致上最大的感谢。好，那刚才其实我们有讨论过，就是当我们听到真侪无同款的语言会当互相来尊重、互相来问候的时阵，咱是一个足水的代志吼。较拄仔李远部长有讲到遮个物件吼。毋过就是讲，咱其实咱会当看到全世界有足侪国家的经验，拢甲咱讲语言的政策吼，语言的政策，它其实不仅仅是在教育里面使用，它其实关乎到这个人权的保障，包含到少数族群的语言的保障。那它不是一个特殊的这个对待哦，它是一个文化平权、一个语言平权的概念，所以它也是我们民主的侵华跟侵金。 是一个社会正义最重要的代志。所以讲，咱当一个人会当使用咱家己上界舒适的语言来接受教育，得到即个公共的服务，参与咱的政治的生活，表达咱家己的认同的时阵，咱不只是得到语言的便利性尔，咱是一个做公民社会平等参与的一个基本的权利。所以讲，即个语言的权利，嘛是对即个保存到即个平等，已经是咱的国际人权体系的重要的议题。所以我们在联合国，我们在欧洲理事会，还有许多民主国家，都持续在关照国家整体在怎么样取得语言发展的多样性、取得平衡以外，还有透过制度的设定来保障少数语言跟弱势语言的社会的权益。那我们的台湾其实也正经历了这样子的发展，刚才有几位都已经有谈过。所以呢，我们今天要谈的是如何从一个文化保存的角度进一步思考，让不同的语言可以成为公共生活的一部分。那法律的制定当然只是一个起点，我们制定了国家语言发展法，但是我们的整体的使用还有一些空间，所以我们要让语言的权利可以落实在教育、在媒体、在司法、在公共服务，还有数位的环境之中，让每一个语言都可以找到它适当的位置。我想这是我们今天聚集在这边一个很重要的哈。那所以今天我们很荣幸的邀请到国际语言权利研究跟实务领域上很具代表性的人物哈。这个 Doctor 跟 Professor 这个Fernand de Varennes 对。这法语哈，学习当中，那我们很高兴哈，我们的专题演讲者其实他是来自加拿大哈，然后他成长在双语区，那他是一个非常有名的这个人权学者哈，那在超过30年的这个学术跟公共的服务生涯里面，非常的关注在不管是少数民族的语言身份认同，还有人权的保障跟民主治理之间的关系哈。那他在2017年到2023年担任过联合国的这个人权理事会的少数群体议题的特别报告员哈。那他负责推动的就是全球的少数族群权利的保障工作。那他走过的全球世界的地方非常的多。专门都是去看政府、还有民间团体以及国际组间一起怎么合作，建立一个更包容性的社会。那这一次他是第一次来到台湾哈，他2天前才来到台湾，那也是第一次来到我们的国家，所以他的强调，他的所有的著作强调里面都是谈语言权利，其实不是少数的保障特殊待遇。而是一个民主社会更深化很重要的一部分。那他今天呢，特别要从国家语言如何从政策的规划变成是一个能够更民主生根保障的这样子的一个议题来开始讲，然后变成一个更社会包容的社会。那我们今天可以分享他的国际社会在语言权利上保障的这个重要的发展，那我们就以最热烈的掌声来欢迎今天的主讲者 Professor Fernand de Varennes。Bonjour。
Thank you, Professor Jolan, Minister Lee, Minister Gu, Deputy Minister of Education, Deputy Director General of the Indigenous Peoples Council, distinguished legislators, guests, and colleagues, Mesdames et Messieurs. Bonjour tout le monde. I'd like to continue in French, but maybe that wouldn't work very well, so I'll continue in English, but I will try to use a few local languages to greet you. Nagaiho kamo, lokasu, java javai, mihumisang, nin hao, in sign language, hello. Gotsa. Let me first begin by saying thank you and congratulations. Thank you for the invitation to come here today to contribute to this important convention, which I think shows very positive, very good steps towards a much more inclusive and embracing policies and approach to linguistic diversity here in Taiwan. Bravo also, therefore, to the government of Taiwan for the many positive aspects of policies and initiatives, especially, I think, in the last 10 years, or so much which are significant and very positive, much more favorable towards the languages of the communities. They make up the rich tapestry of which is the reality of the people of Taiwan today. As you all know, the government declared indigenous languages and Hakka to be national languages in 2017. In 2019, other heritage languages and sign languages used in Taiwan were added as national languages. And in 2022, the government published this, or a 2022-2026 plan for the development of national languages. All of these are important. All of these are good strategies, and all of these are positive strategies to promote the revitalization and advancement of national languages. They are all inclusive steps for equality between the linguistic and cultural communities that reflect the multicultural reality of Taiwan, what you are in terms of population, of cultures and languages. I believe there's also plans to establish a center for research and development of national languages for their preservation, study, and transmission. Once again, the government of Taiwan must be congratulated for all of these measures and positive steps, positive developments. But much more is still needed because to be truly inclusive and democratic societies, we need not only positive and inclusive policies, there must also be a protective environment for languages both inside and outside of schools and homes to really reflect the reality and needs of the different language communities in the country. My presentation will, I hope, give you perhaps an international and legal perspective on what could be further steps to create not only policies, but also further legislation and institutions and environment in and outside of the home for truly inclusive and democratic approaches which reflect and accept, embrace, and support the linguistic composition of all of the people of Taiwan. It's not only about policy, in other words, it is also about rights. It's not only about the nation, it must also be about the people and all they are in terms of languages and cultures. And to do this, well, I will proceed in 3 steps. To first set the context of where we are today globally at the international level in terms of linguistic diversity and why this is so. Secondly, I will try to explain, again globally, the human reality of the language choices and practices of governments, and especially why and how these can unfortunately lead to exclusion in some cases, to disadvantages, and even denial of fundamental human rights. And finally, in the third and final section, I'll try to show you why truly democratic and inclusive societies must be respectful and must also reflect the linguistic diversity of its people and their language and human rights, and why these are so important and effective in building fair and stable societies. Mesdames et messieurs, let me begin. Let me begin with the context. Human beings are language animals. And it's not an exaggeration to say that language is also power. And yet we are seeing power being concentrated today in less and less languages around the world. Just as economic inequality globally is being concentrated more and more in the hands of small elites around the world. But in both cases, none of those two phenomena are normal, and neither are they healthy. Every 2 weeks, a language disappears, taking with it an entire cultural and intellectual heritage. Most observers believe that more than half of the estimated 7,000 languages or so spoken around the world are endangered. And this rate of extinction has in fact been increasing, going faster and faster, especially in the last few decades, especially since the end of the Second World War. Now, the reasons for this are complex, but yet it's also quite clear. They often occur because of laws and policies which quite often were aimed at the homogenization of societies. The belief sometimes that one language is superior to the others, or that unity of the country means that there is only one possible language and culture for each nation, for each state, and the others must be gotten rid of, in a sense. This is an ideology which has existed for quite a long time and unfortunately continues to exist in a number of countries, in fact, in too many countries, even today. But there are 2 points here that have not always been sufficiently acknowledged or well understood. First, that almost all of the languages which may be lost, along with the traditional knowledge and cultures they represent, are usually, almost always, minority or especially indigenous languages. And secondly, it's not a natural phenomenon that they disappear. They don't simply disappear. In most cases, the decreasing number of languages that you see here involves the decreasing number of speakers of minority or indigenous languages and have nothing to do with natural processes. It is the result of domination, denial, of rejecting these other languages as somehow not appropriate, quite often connected to, well, colonization processes or domination through military conquest and so forth. What has happened for decades, and in fact for centuries in a number of countries around the world, are language restrictions. Even the banning, the prohibition of minority or indigenous languages, sometimes by saying they don't exist, they're not real languages, or excluding their use, especially excluding their use in areas such as education and other public and even private spheres. I want to emphasize this point. A language does not simply disappear. Throughout history, many languages, most languages, and especially minority or indigenous languages, have been actually actively suffocated. Their use mocked, made fun of, because they are considered by those who dominate as they're uncivilized or unworthy, or they're an obstacle to development. Because those in the majority, or those with power, decided it would be like this. And those with power decided that development and progress and the nation must only speak one language. Japanese during the Japanese period here in Taiwan, English or Portuguese or Spanish in many parts of the world through the process of colonization and so forth. And that is how indigenous languages quite often disappeared. They were denied space. They could not breathe. They could not be used. They were denigrated to the point where even those who spoke these indigenous or minority languages came to believe their languages had no value whatsoever. And what do you do with something that has no value? You forget it. You put it aside. But this is not natural. It is the result of policies, practices, and quite often legislation that existed in former colonies around the world that impose European languages or Japanese here in Taiwan, or even Mandarin Chinese. Language is power. Language is, if we reverse that, we go further, it is also the key to inclusion. And let me illustrate this by sharing with you a story of inclusion and language diversity and the power of language. And this story goes back many hundreds of years, but it shows another way, another path, which, had it been followed and continued, would suggest that, for example, indigenous languages could be languages of power and opportunity and development. The very first college, or the very first university in the Americas, in what Europeans describe as the New World, was this. This is the Real Colegio de Santa Cruz. It was established in Mexico around 1536, so almost 500 years ago. The college, and this is one of its unique characteristics, this first college in the New World taught in 3 languages. It used for teaching purposes Spanish. Mexico was a colonial territory at the time. It used Latin, which you will know, it was an intellectual language 500 years ago. But it also used an indigenous language as language of education, of teaching in Nahuatl, which was a widely used spread language in that part of Mexico 500 years ago. This college, produced multilingual, mainly indigenous graduates. The individuals that came out of this college would speak fluent Spanish, the colonial language, a language of the colonial government. They would speak or master Latin as an intellectual language of science and scholarship, and they spoke fluent Nahuatl also. And they became the leaders, the intellectual elites, religious, and social, and political leaders of their society for decades, as a matter of fact. And this surprises a lot of Europeans, by the way. Graduates from this first college, multilingual college with an indigenous language, is one of the languages of education, produced the first grammar of an indigenous language, Nahuatl, in 1547, 3 years even before the first grammar of the French language in Europe. At least for a few decades, while Nahuatl was taught and officially used as a language of education at the Colegio until the Spanish government decided to stop supporting it, the use of an indigenous language in education, but also for other official purposes, including government colonial affairs, meant that individuals that were fluent in the Nahuatl language, but also spoke the colonial language Spanish and Latin, they actually were the leaders, well-educated indigenous intellectuals and leaders, and occupied, in reality, most of the significant political and government positions at the time, and actually occupied most of the best opportunities, if you will, for education, for employment, for leadership, and for other opportunities in this environment. This example, the case of the indigenous language Nahuatl, and of how a government which used this language as a language of public education, it is an example of where a minority or indigenous language can be a language of opportunity, of power, and how language can be used to include, or if you don't accommodate the indigenous languages, how language policies can exclude. And the exclusion came because this college was too successful. It gave power and opportunities to indigenous peoples. What happened a number of decades later, the Spanish government decided that this multilingual approach favored too much, was too positive for the indigenous populations. And they decided that those that were bilingual were too much of a challenge, and the government of Spain essentially decided that only the Spanish language should be used in education, in also the institutions of government from about the end of the 17th century. In fact, the government of Spain, the colonial government of Spain, adopted a law banning the use of any languages other than Spanish throughout the empire during that time. And eventually, other laws for the next 100 years had the clear purpose of getting rid of indigenous languages in the colonies, in the public space. They were still allowed, they still happen, of course, at home, in private activities. But all public functions had to completely eliminate the use of indigenous languages, and therefore excluded, had the result of mainly excluding individuals of indigenous backgrounds to a very large extent. And it succeeded in doing that. And the fall, if you will, the growing rejection of indigenous languages is directly a result of those policies, but especially legislation that forced authorities to no longer use indigenous language, to deny opportunities to those who understood and mastered indigenous language, and actually denied any value in the use of indigenous languages in official areas. The consequences of such policies. Policies, but also of laws, which only allows one language for one country, because that ideology, one nation, one language, really became more widespread from about the 18th century. We are still seeing those consequences of exclusion on the basis of language, of only accepting one official or one national language to the exclusion of all the others, regardless of the discrimination or disadvantage that this creates. And that explains why, even today, what has happened to indigenous and minority languages, including here in Taiwan, are hotspots for language extinction, which includes Taiwan. Taiwan is in an area which is considered a hotspot of endangered languages worldwide. So why do we still have so many language hotspots of languages continuing to disappear today at faster and faster rates, at least it seems so? Aren't we worldwide more democratic? Well, I think we can say probably not. We know that in some countries, democracy is going backwards. But even in democracies, aren't we more inclusive, more respectful of our human, linguistic, and cultural diversity? And the answer, even today, is not always very clear or not always straightforward. Many countries are still not really or effectively adopting inclusive policies and approaches when it comes to languages. And in many cases, too many cases, you have governments that still have in place policies and laws that actually are hostile, or at least have negative impacts in relation to multilingualism. Or even, we still have governments who reject the whole premise that language diversity is a good thing, that language diversity is desirable, or that governments should respect the languages of their people other than the language of the majority. This is not universally accepted. This is not universally embraced in all countries of the world, and not even in all democracies, although it is making progress. It is becoming better understood. Numerous reports, and I think we can say that most objective observers agree that excluding minority and indigenous languages from being used or taught in schools is negative, that it is detrimental, and in fact results in exclusion in many situations. To summarize what you have here, among the many different kind of reports that do exist, this is from a World Bank report on education and the use of minority or indigenous languages. And one of its rather striking conclusions is that almost half of the world's children are not taught in the language they use at home. They're not taught in their own languages in a way. And the World Bank report, looking at a variety of other scientific studies on this also, concludes that this has negative effects in the sense that it is clear that if children are taught in their own language for at least 6 to 8 years, and let me emphasize the point here, this does not mean only receiving 1 or 2 hours a week of teaching in their own language. This is teaching mainly in the language of children for at least 6 or 8 years if possible, that this has extremely positive results. In the sense that not only do children learn their own languages well, they also have the intellectual and academic abilities to learn other languages well. Now, this may sound counterintuitive, but it essentially means that when you have a child that is well educated in their own language, they can learn other languages more easily, better, and longer. So that if you really want multilingual children, the best approach is to first begin to teach them in their own language. And it has other positive reinforcing effects. Children have greater self-confidence when they hear their own language being used by a teacher and learning through that language at the beginning. There are many reports, surveys that show that they will have overall better school results, that they will stay in school longer when they are taught in their own language. So the academic benefits are clear when you have education in a child's own language. If you take the coin, you look at the other side, what do we see? If children are not taught in their own language, you have negative results. It's obviously logical. And that this means that a child that is not taught in the language that it is the home language will actually be disadvantaged. A child will probably be able to learn to say in school. Some children will do extremely well, but for most children, not being taught in their own language will have negative consequences. You have to look at the whole, not just the number of exceptional cases. In case these examples only seem to apply to indigenous people or minority languages in Asia or Africa, I wanted to use an example of the effects of over 200 years of legislation of laws in what is today Ireland. And Ireland used to be a colony, by the way, of the United Kingdom, where for almost 200 years, in fact more than 200 years, there were various prohibitions, legislation that prevented the use of the Irish language. And you can see here, over a period of 200 years, how these legislation, these laws against the Irish language, these laws that prevented education in the Irish language, that also actually prevented you from having jobs with the government if you spoke Irish. The impact is that the people who identified or recognized that they could speak the Irish language went down for 4 million people about 200 years ago to today less than 72,000 who are fluent in the Irish language in Ireland. And once again, I want to emphasize this is not natural. This is clearly the consequences of language laws, language policies and practices that try to force, to impose English only in a country where initially most people spoke Irish. And even today, the Irish language is now an official and national language of Ireland. Ireland is now independent of the United Kingdom. But you know, once you've suffocated a being for so long, its growth has stopped. And it is still difficult to revitalize that language. The numbers have still been going down, although there are a number of very positive steps that have been taken in that country. So this disappearance, this suffocation of languages through policy and legislation is not only a phenomenon here in Taiwan or in Asia or Africa or in South America. It is a phenomenon which has occurred wherever you have certain languages whose existence is denied or which are seen as the dominating segments of society as, for whatever reason, undesirable. Exclusion, repression, discrimination. These are the words that you will often see associated with the laws, policies, and practices that ignore and deny the linguistic and cultural reality of all of the people in a country. This is not directly connected to the theme of today's convention, but I thought I should just bring you one warning from a global perspective. We are still seeing around the world a lot of conflicts, of violent conflicts, wars, involving ethnic groups. And quite often, quite a few of these conflicts actually involve language grievances or language claims. Some of you may remember the civil war in Sri Lanka many decades ago, where it was members of the Tamil minority who claim in Sri Lanka that they were victims of discrimination, that they had no opportunities for employment, no opportunities for education, linked to their language, as a matter of fact. The story is complicated, but it is a story that we see in many parts of the world. I hope you can see what this report, this is a very important report, which is unfortunately not very well known. It is a report of the only joint report, I think, even today, of the World Bank and the United Nations. And one of the points that it emphasizes here, is that it is clear that around the world, the rise of violence and ethnic conflicts that we've seen, especially in the last few decades, are connected to when communities are left behind, including in social and economic spheres, because this creates feelings of, well, exclusion, of discrimination, and of a possibility, a potential for frustration and tensions that to increase, which often, or I should say too often, leads to conflict. And the best way to prevent conflict is to have measures that are more respectful and inclusive in terms of economic and social participation, and that fully respects the human rights of these groups. And these human rights of groups, where you often have tensions that might lead to conflicts, include linguistic and cultural identities. And therefore, the ultimate point here is that achieving peace and stability means justice and inclusion. And in many cases around the world, this includes language considerations. And this, ladies and gentlemen, brings me to the third part of my presentation. How and why, globally, languages have power and can be pathways for building fair and stable societies. History shows us that you can exclude or at least disadvantage indigenous or minority communities and their members by banning, prohibiting their language. And thus, what you're doing when you do not use, you do not recognize, you do not permit the use of these languages, this results quite often in economic, social, and other denial of opportunities, because you're not allowing or providing for the use of their languages. By using a minority language or an indigenous language in areas of public services, public education, you are actually creating opportunities for jobs. You need teachers that teach in indigenous or minority languages. You need nurses and doctors. Oh, by the way, this is an important area. If you have a doctor or a nurse to really take care of the health of individuals, a nurse or doctor should be able to communicate as much as possible in the language of the individuals when they are sick. There are many reports that actually demonstrate this. That means if you actually have obligations to provide equal quality and equal access to health care, to public health care, you should have, as much as possible, nurses and doctors that can communicate effectively in their language. Nurses and doctors that speak minority languages or speak indigenous language. That actually creates exceptional opportunities for advancement. Now, you can't do it for every group, and I'll explain why. You need a significant enough number and concentration of speakers of a minority or indigenous languages. But language is power. Language can be opportunity, especially if the government recognizes the obligation to use these languages in areas of public service. It actually creates jobs for those individuals who are truly bilingual, who truly can communicate with part of the population, part of the people who have a different minority or indigenous languages, and creates opportunities for advancement for them. And this is connected to the modern development of human rights. After the Second World War, the principles of justice and fairness and equality for everyone were to become really the moral and legal principles around which we have built what we know today as human rights. And if we go back to the Second World War, this evolution of this idea of human rights is really a rejection of racial superiority and an agreement after the Second World War in the very first words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and here I will quote it directly, the recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Freedom, justice, and peace. How? Through the recognition of the dignity and equal rights of all of us as human beings and of what makes us human beings, including our language. So this evolution, and it is an evolution after the Second World War, includes dignity and equal rights for one of the main characteristics of that which makes us humans, our languages. And here, I think we need to be clear and to describe it very clearly. Language is not only a means of communication. It's not simply a tool. It is central to the human condition, to societies, cultures, and traditions. A language is like a bridge to which communication and transmission of knowledge, of information, culture, and traditions between individuals, but also it's also a link between generations. A language can actually bring us back to our ancestors hundreds of years behind us. And it is a way to speak to future generations. And that is why in recent decades, there has been recognized at the international level that human rights include certain language rights in order to, as explained in this document from the United Nations Mandate of Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, which I basically wrote. So I have to do some self-promotion here. This is actually a report that I wrote a number of years ago. It actually, I think, clearly states that the language rights of minorities and indigenous peoples are human rights in international law. They are the application of a number of legal requirements, legal obligations, such as freedom of expression in private activities, and private activities including the use in private schools and private media. Language rights can include the prohibition of discrimination in areas such as public education, the language of public services such as healthcare or social services that I described earlier, where this is reasonable and practical. There are restrictions, by the way, which I'll try to detail a little bit later. Human rights even protect the right to your own name, to have your own name in your own language, as connected to the right of private life. And if I can tell a little story, not every country allows you to have your own name in your own language. Some countries say you must have a name in the official language. Now, I like my name, Fernand de Varennes. I think it sounds very nice, doesn't it? But I know of one country in the world where I went to conferences and they would not accept my name, Fernand de Varennes. It was an official conference, and the government, and this is in Europe, the government of this country said, no, for public purposes, we have to change your name to an official language sounding name. So Fernand de Varennes became Fernand de Varennes. Okay, it doesn't sound too bad, but honestly, Fernand de Varennes is much, much, much better. And it is connected to my family, to my origins, to my identity. So there are a number of human rights that have a direct impact that can be said to protect language to some degree. Now, this is still a relatively new area of international law. And in some parts of the world, it's not unanimous, it's not always well understood. But at the global level at the United Nations, including UNESCO, and even the International Court of Justice, has been making some progress in recent years. So I'll give you an example. I'll try to give a concrete example in the area of language and education of how this can work. You do not have equal treatment in education if you are not taught in your own language. I'm trying to explain it from a human rights perspective. Some individuals receive the benefit of being taught in their language, but others, usually minorities or indigenous people, will not have the equal treatment if they do not receive education in their language. So there's a distinction based on language, where you have some children who are taught in their own language and others who are not. The question from an international human rights point of view is this distinction reasonable and justified? If it is not reasonable or justified, then you have discrimination in international law, which is prohibited. It's a universal human rights obligation. And in some cases, especially if you have a large number of speakers of an indigenous or minority language, especially if they're concentrated in a region and has been traditionally used, it's not reasonable. It's not justified to deny using that language in education if you can reasonably accommodate and use that language in education to some degree at least. And this means that you can force a government, if it actually intends to respect international human rights, and the prohibition of discrimination, if the government wants to respect its international obligations and international human rights, then it must use that minority language or that indigenous language to a reasonable degree where it's actually practical to do so. And there have been a few cases internationally that have said, yes, this is the accurate, the correct interpretation of international human rights in the area of public education and discrimination on the ground of language. It's still new. It's still relatively not well understood or discussed, but it is something that has come up even at the International Court of Justice in a case between Russia and the Ukraine, where the International Court of Justice agreed to not have public education in a minority language in some cases is discrimination and a violation of international law. The exact context, conditions where this will be the case, well, that has to be looked very closely because every situation is different. It gets complicated, and my time is going to run out soon, so I'll try to go a little bit faster. There's not one single approach. I emphasize the human rights approach, but there are other areas of international law that look at languages from a different approach. There are treaties that refer directly to the protection of endangered languages and only endangered languages. There are documents that talk about, and treaties that talk about the promotion of linguistic diversity itself. Now, these are different approaches. They're not the same as human rights approach. Human rights approach and treaties tend to only recognize individual human rights. So all three are different sources, different approaches that you find in terms of international law that can be said to protect some kinds of language rights. They're not identical. Quite often they can overlap, but they have different objectives. Once again, I can share with you various reports and research on these various approaches, but these are the three main measures or directions used at the international global level in relation to languages. They're not identical as such. One of the reasons I have not emphasized the protection of endangered languages and the protection or promotion of linguistic diversity is that, to be very honest, they tend to be very weak. And so it's easier for governments to actually avoid any kind of obligations because there is no real enforcement, and even the wording of these documents can be very weak. They're still important if you have a receptive government that can be used very effectively. But I just want to bring to your attention that we have many different approaches, and it's not a monolithic situation. Language rights, to quickly go through these. Language rights which come from human rights, international human rights, you can find in a number of treaties. There are more than that, but I thought it would be useful for you to see some of them. These include the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education. It's a very important document, actually. And the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. By the way, for users of sign languages, one of the most important or significant sources of the right to use sign language and require governments to provide services in sign languages is actually the prohibition of discrimination on the ground of language or access to various services. For indigenous peoples, one of the most important documents at the international level for language rights is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is an extremely important political, and I would say moral document. It contains principles such as such as Article 13, which talks about the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literature. And it recognizes also an obligation on governments to take effective measures to ensure this right is protected. I hesitate a little bit only. I think it is an extremely important document in terms of language rights for indigenous peoples. It is one of the only international documents that clearly talks about the right to revitalize a language. That is extremely rare. And you have it, in fact, I think maybe even perhaps only in this document. But it's not a treaty. So from a legal point of view, and you have to excuse me, I am a jurist, I am someone with a legal background. It's actually not a legal document. It's more a political statement, a statement of principle, an important one, a very significant one if you have a government which is receptive, which is open, which is willing to be inclusive and democratic. But it does not have the legal weight, the legal impact of a treaty in international law. To try to finish rather quickly, I want to emphasize that not all languages should or can be treated the same. It is a mistake to believe that you can treat a language with only 10 speakers in the same way as you can a language with 1 million speakers. And in international law, there is a difference that can be recognized and made depending on whether you are dealing with indigenous people. Now, in the case of indigenous peoples, there are more obligations in terms of trying to revitalize, to return their languages to a more normal state in recognition of the injustices that were done in the past. There are indigenous peoples. There are also national minorities, which have more language rights, or language rights that can be more generous when you have a group, a language group, which has a long historical connection to a country. So here, the Tahi, the Hakka, for example, would be considered national minorities in international law. And that really means, particularly in the area of education, public education, governments must try to be more generous and accepting and to put into place institutions such as public schools and access to public services in their language. So national minorities is not the same thing as indigenous peoples, but they do have a significant degree of language rights that are recognized in different instruments. Other individuals, including immigrants, do have also language rights, particularly in terms of individual rights connected to non-discrimination and freedom of expression. And of course, a government is always allowed to privilege the language of the majority and to have all services and institutions use the language of that majority. So to conclude, because I have been reminded that I only have 1 minute, Taiwan is building a fairer society with its language plan and strategies for a more inclusive and stable society in the long term. And perhaps it can be the Switzerland of Asia. I say Switzerland, by the way, because Switzerland is the most stable country, one of the most stable countries in Europe for hundreds of years. It's also one of the most prosperous countries in Europe, and it has 4 national and official languages, which uses these minority languages quite extensively. I was going to, I had a lot more showing what is not an inclusive and democratic approach, including the policies of the People's Republic of China in relation to indigenous peoples or minorities such as Tibetans and Uyghurs. But I have been very politely indicated that my time is up. So, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, I would simply like to say thank you very much for your patience, for your time. In International Sign Language, thank you. Merci, 谢谢, Toshi Ali, thank you.
Merci beaucoup. 我们非常谢谢我们今天的专题演讲者哈。那因为时间的关系，我想就赶快来开放给在场的人哈，咱来开放和大家来问问题哈。OK， 请立法委员，这那个有。就多么的一个好一挂，好，谢谢。
Professor Xie, my honorable guest, I benefit so much from your speech. Thank you. I teach in nearby university in English for 20 years, copyright law. I found I am mistake. That is the wrong policy. From your speech, I should teach in Minnan language. My students' performance will be better. I went to Cambridge to get a PhD there and study copyright law. And in order to transform copyright law into copyrighted products, to develop audio-visual industry in Tainan area, I spent so much time to study German, Japanese, to know Taiwan well. I have 5 interesting stories to show Taiwan, not just now. Actually, it used to be a multilingual society. The first story is about the Dutch in Taiwan. Even now, in nearby area, our farmer still use acre to measure our land, because the Dutch tier land in Europe by horses. One morning acre, that is acre, 1 unit. So in Taiwan, the Dutch use oxen to tier land, and they teach our ancestor. In German, it is similar to ein Morgen Acker, 1 morning acre. That is quite long, right? Our ancestors shortened it as ga. So now we still use ga. That's acre ga as our unit of land. That's the first interesting story. The second interesting story, our farmer now, even in Tainan, would like to rent an orange garden to harvest, or to rent a pond to fish. Until now, they don't use rent. They use Pacht. Pacht, that is German word, rent. In order to check whether this story is true or not, I went to Nancy's, Pennsylvania. There is one important area called Amish area. They speak all German, quite similar to all Dutch, and they really use Pacht. That is quite interesting. So now, even in Taiwan, this area, we use Pacht. That is the Dutch traditions. And another 2 stories is about Japanese in Taiwan. When the Japanese in Taiwan first, they
徐委员，我们不好意思，我们讲先2个故事啊，看你有没有时机要问他的问题，要不然因为我们怕那个时间，一个人发问是3分钟，不好意思，嘿。
Okay. The Japanese call milkfish in this area called sapa, masapa. That is true sapa, very delicious. And the final story, I shortened it. There are some places in southern Taiwan called fire accident shop. Fire accident shop. In 700s, during Qing Dynasty, Taiwanese map already marked that area as 火烧店, 火烧店. Our historian interpreted 火烧店, fire accident shop, because their shop got fire. That is rubbish. Actually, 火烧店 sounds similar to wholesale shop, wholesale. Before, about 360 years ago, the English trade with Taiwan, but their number is limited. So they can only open this kind of wholesale shop. And our ancestors still can use local language, 火烧店, to mark this wholesale shop. This kind of story quite interesting. that is an instrument, like you say, to educate, to develop industry. I benefit so much from your speech. Thank you.
好，我们再次也提醒，我们的现场发问时间是3分钟的时间。
3分钟好，张教授、学强教授。
较多啊吼，教授有讲吼，毋是所有的拢啊当做共款叫做平等吼，啊伊嘛有记即个客家做咧吼，讲伊的历史根源吼，所以伊会当讲嘛是爱尊重伊的权利吼。啊，咱即马。互即个客家原住民，包括台语，拢是用领土原则，讲伊会当做区域的通行语。但是台语的状况其实人口上甲因无啥共款。台语全台湾用伊会晓讲的差不多86%，伊的族群语言的人口差不多76.9%，所以伊用领土原则来讲，有可能会形成问题。吼，啊，我要请教的是讲吼，像台语，我较仔讲伊的人口基础，啊，甲伊的语言人口，伊应该安怎规划，才会合咱即马咧追求的即个inclusive吼，包容啊，佮公平的一个语言政策。我咧讲的是讲咱台语安怎规划吼，较好势。好。
Thank you very much for your question. I think there are, in different countries, different models that can be useful. I'll use the example of Canada. I think can show you how there is a practical approach to dispersed language groups. French and English are 2 official languages. French is a minority language in all of Canada. The majority is English. But French as the minority official language cannot be used everywhere in the country. It's not practical, it's not possible. Where you have a sufficient concentration of French-speaking people, and the law actually provides for ways of measuring that, you can be guaranteed, for example, education in the French minority language if you have a sufficiently large number of parents or people who speak the French language across all of Canada. When it comes to other services, it's more practical oriented in the sense that you need to show, well, one way of showing it is that in all of Canada, there's only one bilingual province, and that is the province of New Brunswick, where you have 30% French and 65% English and other languages. The province of New Brunswick is all bilingual because there you have a quite large proportion of French, and the French could be compared to the Hakka in that situation. In other parts of the country, there is Quebec, which is mainly French because you have millions of French or Hakka-speaking people in that region. Then it's obviously that the main language of the services will be in French. But in other parts of the country, if you do not have a large enough percentage or proportion of the French, or we could say Hakka speakers, then you're not guaranteed all services from the government, from the federal government in the French language. So it is a very territorial practice based on what is practical and concentration. Even in a very, very big country like Canada, it does allow for most even speakers of French to have, or Hakka, to have access to services in their own language, and especially in education. It's much more generous when it comes to education. There, the national government provides for sufficient support so that even relatively small French-speaking communities, for them to have access to education in their own language in public schools. So that shows that you can have one or different models depending on how dispersed or concentrated you have speakers of different minority languages. Another example is Finland, where you have a small Swedish-speaking minority, where you have one region where they're concentrated, where they have most services in their own language. But in other areas, you really have to look at, is there a community or a village here where you have significant number of Swedish or Hakka speakers? And if so, there's actually a formula. I forget what it is, 5,000 people inside a village or 20%. And if you fulfill that formula, then you have access to services, public services in the Swedish minority, or we could say Hakka language. There are many other models. And so it may seem like it is very difficult because you talked about how the Hakka language or communities can be dispersed. But in reality, there are a number of countries that have different approaches, even though you have also dispersed linguistic communities. I would say that with some of the researchers that are beginning to work in this area, you should be able to identify a few model approaches that provide clear guidelines of how to deal with dispersed communities, what kind of, what would be reasonable and proportionate and feasible in the context of Taiwan, and look at other countries, for example, where I think there are some interesting examples and approaches that could be adapted to reflect closer the situation and the challenges that you have here. So complex, yes. Difficult, yes. Impossible, no. There are approaches, I think, that can be very useful, that could actually respond to the situation of Hakka.
好好，谢谢。那我们提醒一下哈，如果等一下发言的时候，麻烦您提供您的发言条哈，给我们的这个单位哈。来，能够有咁什么问题要问？好，来先后边这个朋友，好，哦，手语，嘿，手语，手语老师可以吗？ 手语老师，
好，我们手语的时间是5分钟的时间。
好，有口语老师可以看得到。OK。
第二个有2个问题，第一个想请问联合国研究的有濒危语言。 总共有7000多个，对不对？那想请问，这研究的7000多种消失的语言里面有没有包含手语？这是第一个问题。第二个问题，刚才有提到共融，那现在讨论语言共融，对吗？针对少数族群的语言这个问题来了。 族群共融会不会影响语言也消失？我举个例子来说，例如原住民的语言，本来现在看来是在消失中，比较难复振，但是渐渐的，因为政策的推动、鼓励跟价值观的转变，原住民族的语言跟平地人、汉人可以结婚生孩子，它的 血统已经融合在一起了，所以它变成是一个多元文化，也会影响母语变异，也可能会更消失。所以我希望可以回答这方面的问题，怎么解决？
谢谢. You could marry only people who speak your language. But seriously, I will answer your first point. First, are the 7,000 estimated languages in the world, do they include sign languages? The short answer is no. That number comes from study of linguistics, which tend to look at what I sometimes describe as natural languages or ethnic languages. That's the short answer. The longer answer is that at the United Nations, we now recognize sign languages as full and natural languages, as a matter of fact. In one of my reports to the United Nations General Assembly, which dealt with linguistic minorities, I indicated that sign languages are full languages. They have their own cultures, their own patois, dialects, varieties. There's not one single sign language. As you know, there are many different sign languages that have evolved in different countries and parts of the world. And so at the United Nations, I believe I was the first UN expert to say officially and to indicate that sign languages are languages for the purposes of international human rights law. And I think that position is now the position within United Nations institutions. If I can actually use this opportunity to say that I am happy to say, I am quite proud of what I did. I was able to encourage the government of Slovenia to change its constitution and to recognize, I think it was 4 different sign languages as official languages under the constitution of the country of Slovenia. And I would encourage the government of Taiwan to think along those lines. A national language is important, but a national language does not have the same legal connotation, the same legal meaning as an official language. And I think official language implies stronger commitments and obligations on the part of a government for their use. So this is something that maybe could be explored also for Taiwan. To go back and answer more seriously your second question about inclusivity, and whether being inclusive may mean that we are diluting or weakening different minority or indigenous languages. It's a difficult question. People are free to marry who they want. But sometimes you have to understand that it's not always in one direction. I know, for example, of individuals who have chosen to join the minority or indigenous linguistic community. They marry, their husband or their wife is a member who speaks an indigenous language or a minority language, and their spouse, their partner, their married partner, has decided that they want to embrace also their language. So it can go both ways, and it's true that it's more common that people assimilate to the language of the majority, the dominant language, but sometimes inclusivity means that others are willing to become members of a minority or indigenous community, especially if this indigenous or minority language community is strong or proud, or if there are education and other opportunities connected to knowledge of that language. Make your language attractive. Make it interesting. Create opportunities around that language outside of the school. That is extremely important. And in fact, I would add, and thank you for the question, to revitalize a language, it's not enough to teach 1 or 2 hours a week in a school. No, let's be honest. That is absolutely not sufficient. What you need is, as much as possible, education in that language for as many years as possible. What you need are teacher positions, jobs, other positions, employment opportunities created associated with the use of that language outside of school and outside of home. Then, and make it also interesting. You can do that with different technologies. Then, if you create opportunities around a minority or indigenous languages, then you can attract your own children. Then you can attract maybe other people who might actually be interested in learning this language and making a life within the community that use this language. There are a lot of sufficient examples that show that this is the case. Language is power. Do not limit the language, or it's not enough to actually only have programs that only allow 1 or 2 hours of education a week in a school. That is a good step. It's an important step, but it is not a sufficient step if you really want to strengthen indigenous or minority languages in this school, in this country. Thank you for your question.
好，非常的谢谢哈。那我们今天的场次其实时间也差不多哈。那我想最后非常的谢谢，因为我们有提到，其实语言不仅仅是一个沟通工具哈，它也不仅仅是我们强调的文化的载体，它也是我们的一种族群的这个权利哈，还有包含权利哈 ，rights 跟 power 其实是一起的。那我们非常谢谢我们的专题演讲者带来的，就是从他的一些个案的这个讨论，还有建议的哈。他刚才有提到，他在联合国担任这个委员的时候，也把手语哈放在我们这个人权哈这个平等权利的考虑的范畴里面。那最后他真的也是鼓励大家，其实语言并不是我们在学校教2、3个小时。它虽然是在政策里面我们要强加的放进去里面，但是我们其实在走出政策之外，我们所有的地方，包含从家庭、包含社会里面，能够创造一个更包容一起的社会来谈这个语言的平权。那我们再一次用最热烈的掌声来谢谢我们的讲者 ，Thank you, merci beaucoup, thank you so much。
非常感谢咱的主持人加罗兰。教授也有咱的 Fernand de Varennes 教授。Let's take photo together here。再次掌声献给我们的谢瑞兰教授以及我们 Fernand de Varennes 教授。Merci à vous。Merci。Let's take。再次感谢谢瑞兰教授以及 Fernand de Varennes 教授。接下来是我们10分钟的中场休息时间，请贵宾稍作休息，也把握时间跟身旁的朋友交流。我们将在11点10分准时进行第2场的主题演讲，敬请准时回到我们的会议厅。咱11点10分要进行第2场的主题演讲，请大家准时入座，非常感谢。好，我们休息的地方呢是在我们的舞台的左手边。待会呢，我们也有稍作这个休息的时间，可以享用我们的茶点。 各位与会的贵宾，欢迎再度回到我们第3届国家语言发展会议的现场。接着我们进行第2场的主题演讲，我们一起把目光投向原住民族的教育以及语言复振的经验。那么接下来这个场次呢，我们要由国立高雄师范大学华语文教学研究所教授、语言与文化教学中心主任钟正成教授来担任主持人。主讲者是美国宾州大学教育学院荣誉退休教授 Nancy Hornberger， 要他从多年的研究里头分享原住民教育以及语言复振。接着我们就把时间交给钟正成教授，掌声欢迎。
非常感謝台北請嚟主持一個場次新一份嘅時間，讓啲 University of Pennsylvania 派嚟咧台灣嘅會議啲會議地方呢，因為科技作為個太幫忙所以嗰度呢用河洛話，還有用客話，用台語，用講河洛話台語。還有用原住民話，還有用英文、用法語啲報告其他AI 時代可以幫人做到一件事情，可以，所以AI 可能要帶來一些要注意嘅事情，個另外一個方面嘛帶來個太有幫助從研做語言復振做客話、做河洛話，還有做原住民話語言復振。是從剛剛到一件事情都嚟講，語言復振地步呀傳承才蠻重要。因為大部分語言係對人嚟講，一個語言隔個門向嘅世界啦。一般嚟講，唔係一胎人都可以做到，需要2胎、3胎，甚至是係4胎、5胎人人可以做到語言復振一個工作。每一天語言復振嘅工作做係一定會有效果，所以。對做語言復振嘅學者、研究者，還有教育者，還有嗰度社會人士嚟講，做語言復振啊，都講到一個重要嘅都係要加個樂觀一些啦，要加個歡喜來做一件事情。所以明白講到做語言復振，都講到即個人真係歡喜，有一個機會，第一個時代可以做語言復振，可以做俾成人嚟看，可以做俾其他。學生係看到講，人哋線上啲嘢做語言復振，安個人就係你講嘅喜樂就係講就係歡喜做一件事情所以我講到台灣見嘅社會改好可以幫人哋用這個母語來講出來嗰度事情，能夠做這個好做嘅事。接下來我可能我再呢度英文我來介紹一下，你這邊呢個重要嘅講者 Professor Nancy Hornberger。一方面用英文比有一些時間去做準備，一單人哋一啲人用嚟介紹佢，大概對佢來講，佢係有滿意。另外一方面，對嚟講，大家可能語言接下去，佢會用英文來演講佢基本要講嘅事情。So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Nancy Hornberger, Professor Emerita of Education at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. And one of the world's most influential scholars in bilingual education, biliteracy, bilingualism, language policy, language planning, and indigenous language revitalization. From more than, I think, not 4 decades, maybe 5 decades, from more than 5 decades, Professor Hornberger has advanced our understanding of how language, culture, education intersect in multilingual society and multilingual communities as well. And trained in educational policy studies and linguistics, she is internationally recognized for her interdisciplinary work and led bridges educational anthropology, social linguistics, language policy and planning research. Her scholarship has been shaped by extensive fieldwork in Quechua-speaking community of the Andes, Andes是山的奇楚瓦语 as well as collaborative research with indigenous immigrants, minoritized language communities across the Americas and around the world. Among her most influential contribution is the development of the continuum of biliteracy framework, a groundbreaking ecological model that has transformed how researchers, educators, and policymakers understand bilingual and multilingual literacy development. The framework highlights the dynamic and interconnected dimensions of language learning and literacy practices, providing a powerful lens for designing equitable educational policy and programs in linguistically diverse settings. Professor Hornberger has also been a leading voice in the field of indigenous language revitalization. Through her research on Quechua, Guarani, Maori, Sami, and many other language communities, she has demonstrated how schools, educators, and community partnerships can support the maintenance, renewal, and the flourishing of endangered and minoritized languages. Her work emphasized that language revitalization is not only a linguistic endeavor, but also a matter of cultural identity, social justice, inclusion, and educational opportunity. Professor Hornberger's scholarship, mentorship, and international leadership has inspired generations of researchers and practitioners. Professor Hornberger and I were both advised by Professor Richard Lewis. She was advised by Professor Lewis in the early 1980s. And I was advised by the same professor in the early years of 2000. And Professor Lewis' framework, language orientation, which talks about language as a problem, language as a right, language as a resource, which has very great influence for among 3 to 4 generations who are doing language planning and language policy in the world. Like what I said, 2 months ago, I was in UPenn and had the opportunity to listen to Nancy's talk in UPenn. I was so much inspired by her. And I also truly believe today we will have so much to learn from Nancy's 50 years experience in doing language revitalization. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nancy Hornberger.
Can you hear me? No. Yes? So, now you can hear me. Thank you so much, Professor Chung, for that beautiful introduction. And ni hao, ayim punjay, as we say in Quechua. Buenos dias, bonjour, good morning, or yes, I think it's still good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to present at this conference. I've enjoyed a couple of days of hosting by the Ministry of Culture, the team from the Ministry of Culture showing us a few of the museums here, the wonderful museums that I think have arisen in this era, foregrounding the linguistic and cultural diversity of Taiwan, the Museum of History of Taiwan, and yesterday the Hakka Cultural Park, and really enjoyed learning more about the Taiwanese linguistic and cultural diversity. And I find many resonances with the things that I'm going to talk about today, and I hope that you will also find resonance with the stories I'm going to tell you. I am going to tell you stories. About things I have learned in my work with indigenous communities. Language activists and educators over the past 5 decades, as Professor Chung was saying. Why stories? I'm an ethnographer, and stories are our stock in trade. As an ethnographer of language policy and multilingual education, my questions have always been about how best to serve language minoritized language communities' ways of speaking and the learners in the schools, and how best to support the flourishing of minoritized language communities' ways of speaking, being, and doing through our education systems and practices. And by language minoritized learners, I'm referring to those who bring to school languages or ways of speaking other than the dominant or official school language. And as we heard just this morning from Fernand de Varennes, that's about 50% of the world's school children still today, arriving at school speaking languages other than the language, the dominant or official school language, including refugees, immigrants, speakers of non-standard or indigenous languages. It's not necessarily about being a minority in numbers, but about being minoritized by inequality of status and inequity of treatment, often across multiple generations. I'm sorry, I can't see my slides, so I can't. Oh, thank you. All right, so back to my stories. I've been interested in the experiences of all language minoritized learners and communities, but perhaps most of all, Indigenous learners and ways of speaking, doing, being, ever since I lived and worked with Quechua speakers, as Professor Chung mentioned, Quechua speakers in the South American Andes in the 1970s. Quechua is known as the language of the Incas. It was extended by the Inca Empire, and that's why it's spoken by so many communities today. It was actually a language of empire for the Incas, and by the time the Spanish arrived, the Quechua was widely spoken and continues to be spoken today, although it is also an endangered language, as we heard about this morning. So back to my stories. I want to clarify that ethnographers' stories are not random anecdotes of passing incidents or even journalistic accounts based on fairly rapid fact-checking and interviewing of experts on breaking news events, but rather they are the fruit of painstaking, detailed, and often long-term participant observation, interviewing, and document collection in specific places, whether these are communities or classrooms, real or virtual, one or multiple, but very specific places with the goal of understanding, analyzing, and interpreting people's ways of speaking, doing, being, thinking, and feeling in that place. Importantly, the ethnographer's quest is to understand from an inside perspective, which requires constant and sometimes exhausting attention, reflection, cross-checking, and most of all, humility and respect for the people that the ethnographer is working with. The ethnographer's stories are also informed, of course, by the ethnographer's own way of speaking, being, doing, thinking, and feeling, as well as by a store of theoretical and empirical research. In my case, my research on bilingualism and bilingual education, sociolinguistics, anthropology of education, language policy and planning, and indigenous language revitalization. Those are fields to which I've also contributed over the years, my own studies and conceptual frameworks. And so the stories that I tell here are each one from a different decade and place, mostly from South America, where I've worked longest, but they're not just about that time and place, but about lessons I have seen repeated in other times and places, including South Africa, New Zealand, Paraguay, Mexico, Scandinavia. They are informed also by my conceptual frameworks that Professor Chung referred to, the continuum of biliteracy, which I've written and published about. And I'm not going to go into it here, although it does underlie some of the stories and lessons you'll be hearing. So the stories and lessons I'll tell you about highlight these 4 themes that I've put on the slide here: ideological and implementational spaces, multilingual, multimodal language ecologies, reclaiming indigenous ways, and finally, language and voice. So let me begin with my first story about ideological and implementational space. At Cayarani School in Bolivia, this is the community, we're approaching the community here, and a new school, a new building has been inaugurated the year before that my visit. Can you hear me? Yes. Before my visit in August 2000. And the classrooms in the new building were welcoming, with tables and chairs set up for group work. And this was a welcome change from the ubiquitous rows of 3 students per desk that were sitting facing the teacher in traditional classrooms. Teacher Berta, that you see on the right, had been there 3 years, and she was implementing bilingual intercultural education under what at that time was a very exciting national education reform, the 1994 National Education Reform of Bolivia. And her classroom was decorated with her own handmade posters in Quechua, she showed models of a story, a poem, a song, a recipe, a letter, and she also had posters of the Quechua alphabet and the Spanish alphabet posted on the wall. Also on the wall was a class newspaper. It's hard to see it, but it's right behind those 2 boys' heads. It was called Yaktakapari, Voice of the People. And it featured an article written by the little boy in the white jacket, which was about, it was written in Quechua, and it was about the farmers wanting better prices for their potatoes, which is the community's subsistence crop. And also in this classroom, there was a library corner that had 80 books that were contributed by UNESCO, actually. Through UNESCO auspices, there was a 80-book library contributed to many schools in the highlands of Bolivia for this education reform. And there were 6 big books, all of them in Spanish, but 3 of them were based on indigenous oral traditions. And 2 of the children noticed my interest in these big books, and they gleefully held them up for a photo when the rest of the class left for recess. So this was in August 2000. The Bolivian reform at that time sought to implant bilingual intercultural education, what they call EIB, nationwide, and it incorporated all 30 indigenous languages of Bolivia, beginning with the 3 largest, Quechua, Aymara, and Guarani. The new law had massively expanded the reach of bilingual intercultural education from around 100 experimental schools in the early 1990s to almost 3,000 schools by the early 2000s, and it was reaching 22% of the primary school population at that time, yielding higher rates of graduation, lower school desertion, just as Professor de Varennes was telling us earlier. The reform clearly opened what I have called ideological and implementational spaces for the practice of multilingual indigenous education. So at a place like Cayarani, where teacher Berta was really actively applying, and she embraced the reform and creatively put it into practice, it was really working. In other rural Bolivian schools, though, untouched stacks of the reform's texts remained in locked cabinets in the director's office, and little effort was made to actually implement bilingual intercultural education. So the lesson here was that that top-down policies can open up ideological and implementational spaces, but it's the local people, the local actors, who actually fill those spaces. And they do it by appropriating, interpreting, and at times, I guess I have that here, resisting, or sometimes even expanding beyond the policy initiatives. So local educators are not hopelessly and helplessly caught in the ebb and flow of shifting ideologies and language policies. They help develop, maintain, and change that flow. And I certainly am seeing this in my visits with, we've heard it mentioned already several times today, the policies that Taiwan has seen in recent years opening exactly ideological and implementational spaces for bilingual education, for indigenous language revitalization. So the policies are there, the opening is happening, and it's up to the actors to implement, right? So we move now to the second set of stories, or the second story, sorry. This one to talk about multilingual, multimodal language ecologies. Here's the story. Every year since 1983, and I was there in 1997, and it still has kept on in the years subsequent. Every year since 1983, an Indigenous teacher education course sponsored by the Comissão Pro Índio do Acre, this is now Brazil, sorry, Brazil. During the summer months, they hold this teacher education course in the Amazonian rainforest of Brazil, and teachers come from around the region to this rainforest camp where they do the teacher education. At the 1997 session I attended, there were some 25 indigenous teachers, or profesores indios, representing 8 different ethnic groups whose language varied in their vitality, some with about 150 speakers and others with several thousand. A striking feature of the course was the mutual multilingual understanding among profesores. Their indigenous languages were not only encouraged and used as medium and subject of instruction in the course and later in their own schools, but also the profesores, the teachers, encouraged and exchanged among each other across their different languages. So even if they didn't necessarily speak or understand all the other languages spoken and written by their peers, they read, listened, and looked at each other's work. And what facilitated some of that mutual understanding, they at times used Portuguese as lingua franca. They at times drew on the geometric designs, such as these, that were an integral part of their writing. So in every piece of writing, you saw these geometric drawings that they spent quite a bit of time developing, and these communicated across the language differences. They had common practices of geometric drawings that they also used on their own bodies as tattoos in some cases. Well, not permanent tattoos, but drawings, paintings on their bodies. And at times they simply relied on their shared intra or inter-ethnic experiences. So it really struck me at the time of my visit that their multimodal and multilingual mutual comprehension was very striking to me, even given the great diversity of their languages, and the salience of multimodal drawing and geometric design in their writing practice was also very striking. Each written assignment bore the complex and colorful geometric designs and maps that are as other scholars, Brazilian scholars have done more extensive study of them, but they, Nieta Monte and Lin Mario de Menezes de Souza have demonstrated that these are not just illustrations that accompany the writing, the alphabetic text, but they're actually integral complements to it. And these multimodal expressions contributed to their mutual understanding among themselves across language differences, as well as to the development of their writing in those languages and also in Portuguese. So communicative repertoires, or the linguistic resources that participants draw on in Indigenous education, go beyond multilingual speaking and writing to include also graphic, artistic, gestural, kinesic, digital, and other communicative modes. The multimodal, multilingual language ecologies characterizing language learning and teaching practices in these spaces offer potential to strengthen each individual participant's linguistic repertoire while simultaneously fostering peer interaction and collaborative learning. And relating this to Taiwan, to my recent experiences, I was very struck in yesterday's visit to the Hakka Cultural Park, where the guide was explaining to us about the, they're called words respecting pavilions that some of you may be, I hope probably most of you are familiar with, the pavilions that were used to burn paper with writing on it. And it was a cultural practice, or maybe it still is, a cultural practice in Hakka communities, which really demonstrated the value of the actual written text, the characters themselves, which to me relates to this whole notion of the physicality, the multimodal and multilingual nature of the writing practices. The third theme that we're going to take up, and the story that goes with it, take us back to Bolivia, to the bilingual education reform in the 1990s, and the site of a master's program that was developed for Indigenous bilingual educators. And let me read to you the story. The Proeib Andes is what it was called. It's a master's program in bilingual intercultural education for Indigenous students, and it was held at the university, it is still held at the University of San Simón in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And it was created in the ideological and implementational space of the 1994 reform. In September 2004, I did a series of workshops on ethnographic research methods with the fourth cohort of students, which consisted of 42 students from 6 different Andean countries and at least a dozen different indigenous languages. And in our final unit of that series of workshops, I told them about the indigenous research agenda that was proposed by the Maori researcher in New Zealand, Linda Tuiwai Smith, that some of you may have heard of. She wrote a book called Decolonizing Methodologies that was published originally in 1999. A very influential book since then. And she talks in terms of, I think that it says there, 4 tides or conditions in which Indigenous people live: survival, recovery, development, and self-determination. 4 directions or processes through which they move: healing, decolonization, mobilization, and transformation. And finally, she talks about 25 projects that Indigenous people undertake, such as reclaiming, renaming, remembering, revitalizing, networking, connecting. These are some examples of the projects that she describes. And her metaphors are very much based on their island ocean ecology, the notion of tides, the notion of winds and directions. And I wasn't really sure how that would go over in the high Andes with the indigenous teachers who are far from the ocean, not like here where you're right next to the ocean. But actually, they were extremely attentive, and they took a lot of notes. They showed clear moments of resonance and response, and they really buzzed among themselves when I mentioned the project that she calls Connecting. And I told of her example of reinstituting the traditional Maori practice of burying the afterbirth after the child is born. So the word in Maori for afterbirth and the word for earth is the same, actually, in Maori. And this was students in these high Andes were really resonating with this. It was a familiar practice to them also. They also resonated when I mentioned the project that she called Renaming, the renaming of places and people with their original indigenous names. And they came up with their own examples, including, for example, Aguaruna. I don't know if anyone who's studied South American indigenous culture had studied about the Aguaruna, but the name that the indigenous students were promoting at that time, instead of Aguaruna, was Awahun, which is the original indigenous name. So at the end, I asked the group, ¿Qué les parece? What do you think? And they immediately replied, which was very memorable for me. Estamos con la linda. They said, we're with her. And they not only said we're with her, but they used her first name. It was a very, a very clear sense of connection for them with the research framework that she was introducing. So these indigenous educators resonated with her notion of connecting, in the sense of connecting people to each other and to the earth. And in later interviews, I asked them what it means to be indigenous, and the first and most prominent responses were about living close to the land. And I know this will sound very familiar to many of you who work in indigenous communities. Living close to the land, speaking one's native language, and experiencing discrimination by others. So these themes about affirmation of one's own ways of doing, being, and speaking, and at the same time experiencing discrimination by others for those very practices, were foremost in the collective story of these individuals' experiences of and reflections about being indigenous. Envisioning and building an indigenous future was another theme that resonated with the Andean educators. Let's see. I'm sorry, my vision has deteriorated a lot this year, and I'm not seeing. So I just want to make sure you're on the same slide that I want you to be on. Let's see. Okay, good. This is the quote from Moises Sujo, who was one of the students in the program with me. And he spoke about reclaiming and reaffirming and revitalizing indigenous ways. And he said, in Spanish he spoke to me, "For me, being indigenous means identifying with my ethnic people, our past, our history, our worldview, our language. In the present, working to reclaim our rights, being actively committed. And in the future, projecting that our ethnic people might have a future with equality of opportunities with other peoples of our country." And I should say that Moises has gone on from being in this program as a student to leading major initiatives in bilingual education and indigenous language revitalization in the capital of Peru among the Aymara communities. So he's put into practice what his dreams about being indigenous mean for him. His commitment to take and use his present graduate studies to improve the lives of his people, drawing on their collective past to project toward the future. Through both lived experience and intellectual study, he and his peer indigenous educators are fully aware of the enormous structural obstacles and historical oppressions they face, and they consciously choose the path of what has been called transformational resistance, often at great personal cost. They opt to, as another ProAbe student says, aprovechar el espacio que el Estado nos da, exploit the space the nation state gives us, through multilingual education, to work toward the future equality and dignity of their people, and thereby of all people. Indigenous education affords spaces for reclaiming, reaffirming, and revitalizing indigenous ways of speaking. There we go. Ways of speaking, doing, being, thinking, and feeling. It's about choice, as foremost U.S. scholar of Native American education, Teresa McCarty writes. Choice lies at the heart of contests over indigenous sovereignties, self-determination, and linguistic human rights. Denial of the right to choose educational approaches, particularly media of instruction, is the trademark of colonial regimes. The fourth theme, then, language and voice. A fourth story. Multimodal, multilingual practices stood out to me as I learned about Sami language revitalization classes taught out of the Sami Parliament, or Sametinget, in Östersund, Sweden. These were not only the classes, but also the very existence of the Sami Parliament and the Sami Language Center were ideological and implementational spaces that were opened up in part by the legislative recognition of Sami rights in Sweden beginning in the 1990s. And they were appropriated here by these two language teachers appointed by the Sami Parliament. And I visited them with a colleague in 2013. In the two teachers' accounts of their Yeglo materials production, they're holding the box up there in front to show, of their mentor program and of their language barrier project, a variety of materials and modalities emerged, including multilingual word cards for preschools, cooking and handcraft activities, theater and tourist office visits, and language network map making with adult heritage language learners. But most memorable in their accounts was what they called the process of tears, and the pain they found themselves working through with the elders and adults who were enrolled in their classes. They told us of the memories, anger, and shame their heritage learners felt for having learned not to speak Sami, and of the resistance they met from their own families as they struggled to overcome their own internal language police. That was what the term they used, internal language police. They spoke of this internal language police sitting on their shoulder telling them not to speak their indigenous language. The resistance from their families as they tried to learn to speak. Resistance that arose sometimes from the learners' own grown children who themselves resented not having been raised to speak Sami. So a painful process of tears. The teacher's story was a moving account of how these passive speakers became active speakers as they became a strong and supportive group. In the teacher's words, they learned as a group, they rose as a group. This experience of the relationship between language and voice brought me back to my own PhD research on the Peruvian Altiplano in the 1980s. The Peruvian Altiplano, the highlands of Peru, near Puno, Lake Titicaca, for those of you who have ever been there or learned about it. And in that context, another indigenous context of socio-historic and sociolinguistic oppression, I had observed one little girl in both classroom and home settings. You see her there in the red sweater. Her name, I called her Basilia. And she was very quiet. She rarely, if ever, spoke in class. And even though she was in a bilingual Spanish-Quechua classroom. But at home, she was something of a live wire. She talked nonstop to me in Quechua at home, telling me all about the names and ages of her whole family. This is a picture from her home context. Showing me the decorations on the wall of her home, the blankets woven by her grandmother. She borrowed my hat at one point to try it on, and then all this while she jumped on the bed, did somersaults, and cared for her 2 baby brothers. So she was like a total transformation from her classroom behavior to her home behavior. And it struck me then, as it does now, that that little girl, who I call Basilia, lost her voice at school and found it at home. And that use of her own language in familiar surroundings was key in the activation of her voice. Voice wasn't just about using Quechua in the classroom, but being in active dialogue with her environment. So language and voice are related, and interestingly enough, Professor Chung mentioned our mutual mentor, Richard Ruiz, and he had written, I found where he had written that about this issue of language and voice. And he wrote, "Language has a life of its own. It exists even when it is suppressed. When voice is suppressed, it is not heard. It does not exist. To deny people their language is, to be sure, to deny them voice. But to allow them their language," and he was thinking of Spanish in his case in the US context, "to allow them their language is not necessarily to allow them voice." He was thinking of actually the instances where Spanish is allowed in the classroom, but not the community Spanish, not the non-standard Spanish that the children would bring to school, but rather some sort of normed Spanish that was not there. It didn't give them voice. So he was saying that it's one thing to grant use of the language, but another to really recognize and honor the language that the children bring with them to school. When classroom practices are effective in fostering dynamic development of Indigenous learners' language and literacy, it's perhaps because of using their language in ways that mediate voice. And I've written more extensively about this, but using the concept of, the Bakhtinian concept of voice, and as interpreted by some researchers, Holland and Lave, I pulled apart the meaning of voice into dialogism, meaning making, access to wider discourses, and the taking of an active stance. And these elements that really create the conditions for voice are perhaps even more important than, or go one step beyond just including the language. So I was visiting Professor Chung's seminar the other day. Thank you very much for inviting me. And one of the students was asking, or several of the students were asking about what can a teacher actually do to honor languages or to, you know, in bilingual education. Are there any instances around the world where you can point, you meaning me, can point to the people using the continuum of biliteracy, which is a framework I developed for the use of teachers and policymakers and researchers in thinking about ways to implement bilingual intercultural education. Unfortunately, I was able to say, yes, there are examples, and one of the things that has kept me coming back to the continuum of biliteracy over the years has been that many people around the world have adopted it and used it to improve classroom practice. And as I think about it, well, I'll stop at that. So, across the world, in another Indigenous context of multilingual, multimodal classroom practice, this is a dual language honors undergraduate program at the University of Limpopo in South Africa, where they did adopt, this was one of the cases where they used the continuum of biliteracy to think about how to offer a bilingual undergraduate honors degree program in both English, which is was the language of instruction, and Sepedi, the local African language. And program founder Michael Joseph wrote, "It's a kind of learning that is at once about discovering their culture and the great ideas in the literature, one unlocking the other." So it's a process for the students of both researching and investigating their own Sepedi-speaking communities, but using the frameworks that they learn in the program that might come from, there was one case where the framework is a Piagetian childhood development framework, or a Vygotskian childhood development framework, etc. So one unlocking the other. And Indigenous voices thus activated can be a powerful force for enhancing learning and for sustaining Indigenous ways of speaking, doing, being, thinking, and feeling. My last story takes us back to Scandinavia, to Umeå University in Sweden, where I've been a visiting professor since 2012, and personal accounts by Sami colleagues document their own and their families' experiences of discrimination in, for example, histories of Sami schooling, political divisions among the Sami themselves, the challenge of teaching combined classes of heritage and non-heritage Sami language learners. And these Umeå colleagues, Umeå University colleagues, have taken up the spaces opened by recent 2000 and 2009 minority languages legislation in Sweden for Sami language revitalization and teaching. So they're enacting activities such as designing curricula and teaching materials for Sami language teaching. And relevant to one of the questions that was asked earlier, Sami communities are also dispersed across a wide geographical area. So they were developing distance and virtual learning spaces as well. They're engaging in advocacy for Sami immersion and primary education in Umeå municipalities. They're undertaking a Sápmi multilingual literacies research project, serving on the Swedish Sami School Council, developing and advocating for a Sami language teacher education program at their university, and so on and so forth. So many concrete actions taken by language activists and educators to take advantage of the spaces that were opened up by legislation. Hanna Otokoski, a North Sami speaker who was a PhD student and lecturer in North Sami when I started in 2012, but she has since completed her PhD and become a powerful an articulate voice for Sami language revitalization, not just in many of the projects I just listed, but also across Sápmi in Finland, Norway, and Sweden. She's now a professor at a Sami university, actually, in Norway. So, I hope that these stories of Indigenous educators' experiences in language revitalization resonate with you all in thinking about the situation of the Taiwanese Hakka and Taiyi and Indigenous languages in Taiwan. They're both profoundly different from and profoundly the same as those of other multilingual educators. The contested and highly politicized nature of Indigenous education and language revitalization is familiar to those engaged in more general multilingual education efforts. But these stories of Indigenous educators and language activists who fill up and expand on ideological implementational spaces opened up by top-down policies or enact multimodal and multilingual language learning and teaching practices, reclaim their Indigenous ways of speaking, doing, being, thinking, and feeling, and activate Indigenous voices. They speak eloquently of the possibilities for constructing more just and democratic societies in our globalized and intercultural world. It's in their advocacy for the oppressed, and Indigenous peoples are arguably the most oppressed of all peoples in the world. It is in their advocacy for the oppressed that Indigenous education and language revitalization are so politically controversial, and at the same time, why they offer so much hope for a better and more just future for all of us. Thank you again for your attention, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you my stories.
anh tu hồ ai yêu片的你讲还不得他们多多哈，安个以周片的你讲他们多多哈，所以你用啥毕业其实我还不得过块桥嘛个呀哈，所以按你讲也按你讲哈，接下来呢是我们的一个 Q&A 时间呢，我刚刚答应大会就是说我会把时间追上来哈，在12点30分以前我们会结束哈。然后让大家有一个愉快的午餐时间哈，大家可以交流。那等一下提问的时候呢，也麻烦你们先准备一下你的那个提问单，因为现场工作人员他也要收集各位的一个提问单啊。我先做一个很快的一个帮大家做一个整理哈。在全球的语言复振跟双语教育里面，通常我们会讲到口语方面的一个处理。但是呢，书面语方面的处理呢，其实这个部分台湾走的还不够。然后事实上，全球很多的语言复振的区域里面，书面语的复振事实上都还在努力。而书面语复振里面有一个很重要的理论叫做 continual biliteracy， 这就是这个就是 Professor Nancy Hornberger 他一个非常大的理论的一个贡献。所以全球很多都是用他的双读写的连续体的概念去推动，就是说怎么样同时既学得自己母语的读写，同时又习得主要语言的读写，这个双语读写的路要怎么并进？因为我们会建立双口语或者多口语的，就这里讲的多语社会嘛。但是我们一样有多读写的那个 channel 哈，多读写的管道要推动。可是这个部分就会涉及到学校教育，因为读写都是学过来的，口语可能是自然习得可以的哈。所以会涉及到这个，那所以他刚刚很多所讲的内容里面都会提到，他怎么协助在 Andes 就是安第斯山脉一系列。那台湾因为多年来我们接受到的，我们学习的语言复振的概念，通常受英语世界有非常大的影响，因为英语的传播非常快速，所以我们学到的 Maori， 我们学到了威尔斯的一些概念。可是呢， 如果今天是透过 Spanish 或跟英语的一个结合而传播的中南美洲、南美洲等等的概念，还有像是最近我们在讲到的萨米，像挪威、瑞典等等的萨米语的这些概念啊，台湾也正在吸收。可是另外一个 Professor Nancy 一直在提醒我们的一件事情，就是当我们学完之后，你到底要什么？什么是你的？你能贡献国际社会什么？你不是只能一直拿哦，我们一直拿东西，那再来你要给什么？你要贡献什么？你怎么跟国际对话？这边的一个是台湾社会里面，走到现在，我认为一个非常重要的，因为我刚刚计算了一下，早期我们在做语言复振的时候，一直认为说，Mandarin only 国语推行运动对我们造成很大的伤害。国语推行运动从1950年到1987年，总共用了37年。那1988年，该客家话、该火罗话、该语言拿过来，还我母语运动开始，从1988年到2026年，我们现在已经38年过去了哈。所以国语运动37年，我们现在推了38年的，我们要母语回来哈。那所以换句话说，时空背景当然不一样，但是这一代人我们到底要什么？我们可以拿出什么哈？那这个会变成很关键。其实我跟他对话的时候，他一直在提醒这样的一个概念，就是这个时代、下个时代哈，这个概念。好，那我们现在开放现场的提问，不晓得在座的各位有没有任何的问题哈？任何的语种欢迎。来，何庆汉老师。
好，头先啦吼，我要先感谢咱的这个Nancy 教授吼，这真精彩的演讲加分享吼，啊，我思考真济吼，得到真济感谢。啊，我真想要请教的是讲啊吼，台湾即马有拄到一个较特别的问题，就是讲伫演讲内底咱听到的案例，拢是一个强势语言甲一个弱势语言，一个弱势语言咧要复兴要复振，但是台湾即摆情形是一个绝对强势的华语。下面有几啊种无共的弱势语言，啊，这弱势语言互相咧复振的过程当中，因为有一寡互动、一寡接触，吼啊，所以唔知影咱的Nancy教授敢有拄过类似的案例，啊，你会建议讲吼，这语言之间互相应该爱采取什么款的策略来合作，较会好，大家拢好啊，感谢。
Thank you for the question, and apologies that I have to speak English for my answer. Sorry. So you were describing that in Taiwan you have the dominant minority of Mandarin as being imposed on a whole range of well, Taiwanese and then the Hakka and the indigenous languages. Does I mean, what immediately comes, and you were asking about examples of similar situations that I might be familiar with. I guess, in terms of imposition of a dominant, that's why I made the distinction between minority language and minoritized language, because often it isn't that, as in the case of Mandarin, it's not just that they're not a minoritized language, they're a minority language, but the majority languages are actually minoritized, right? The Taiwanese, for example, as a majority language. Not right now, I'm not thinking of other examples, but to me it feels very, will you be very critical of me if I say that it's like other cases of majoritized languages, whether they're in the minority or the majority, like English, for example, being extremely dominant in many of the situations that I've just been describing, or Spanish being dominant in Peru and Bolivia. I'm not sure that if they're in power, as Professor de Varennes was saying, that the powerful ones are the ones who impose their language. So if the Mandarin speakers are in power, then that's similar to English speakers in the U.S. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm not answering your question. I'm sorry. Maybe you can help me out.
Yeah, the question is more like we have a dominant language, which is Mandarin. But we also have a list of minority language like Taiwanese, Hakka, and indigenous language. Those minority language, they have language contact. So he's asking, do you have any example in this kind of scenario how those minority language interact with each other and also coexist or co-speak in the society?
I guess I'm sorry, I don't really have an answer for you. I'll have to confess my ignorance. Or maybe you can help me out.
Yeah, so maybe like in the Quechua in Andes, you just mentioned about there are more than 30 languages. They are doing they try to doing language revitalization in those areas. But I believe those 30 varieties of languages, they are not at the same language status. So some language they might have a higher, they might much more powerful than the other one. So how they do the balance in order to maintain all the varieties in that society.
Okay, thank you for reframing the question. That actually, as Professor de Varennes was saying earlier, there are priorities that a government has to make in terms of, let's say, the Bolivian case. There were three, as I mentioned, three major indigenous languages that did receive priority attention: Quechua, Aymara, and Guarani, so that many resources went into developing materials, developing teacher expertise in those languages, and fewer resources went into the other languages. But they were treated with respect and honored in the implementation, even if not, how can I say it, not equal treatment by numbers of speakers. You can say if there's, also again, sorry, Professor de Varennes, I keep referring to you, but you said it all so beautifully before. Looking at numbers of speakers or numbers of children in classrooms, there are definitely models out there, and including the Continuum of Biliteracy, where you can have speakers of multiple varieties in a classroom, and maybe there can be opportunities for interaction in pairs or in groups of three or whatever for some time periods during the day where they can use their own language. But it's impractical for a teacher to be responsible for teaching in the medium of 10 different languages, let's say, in a classroom. So that you make pragmatic decisions on a case-by-case basis of, but I think the attitude of respect for everyone's language is really key here. Help a little bit.
那接下来那个张教授这边。
即马国家语言发展法通过了后，伊第9条讲咱会当用咱的母语做教学语言。所以某一方面，就拿即个len士教授讲的，已经拍开迄个意识形态的空间。但是实际上的实践，佫足少老师安尼去做。我想，要请教即个len士教授咱要安尼去鼓励这些老师勇敢开嘴去讲母语，用母语教册。第二个是讲因为是双语嘛即马双语教育拢流行讲 translanguage 迄个跨语言实践。 就讲老师其实会当用个多种语言的即个资源去教册。啊，我想讲，请你用你观察的即个双语教学吼，讲伊哪南来南去吼，啊用这多种语言来进行教学即件代志，吼，啊就是讲，即个要安怎鼓励老师有即个用母语教册意识，啊甲讲，咱要安怎用 translation 跨语言实践的方式来教册即件代志，啊，请你举几个例来说明，来鼓舞大家。好，以上。
It's working. Oh, sorry. I know why. It's I have headphones on. So, encourage teachers to use their mother tongue. So they do speak they know how to speak, but they just aren't courageous enough to use it in class. There can be many support systems, let's say, for teachers to do that. When you think about it, the teachers themselves succeeded in the educational system by not using their language, and that's not their custom. So I think having groups of teachers that get together and talk about, what their process or their, let's see, how can I say it, like problem solve together is very helpful for teachers. It's hard to expect one teacher by themselves to just suddenly start using mother tongue in the classroom when they haven't been doing it before. So any kinds of support systems that we can develop as fellow educators, I think is an excellent strategy for helping teachers. And as far as translanguaging, I think it really has to be on a very local space-by-space basis that one decides whether translanguaging is appropriate or whether it's a more of a language separation approach. I remember being quite struck and quite impressed when I visited the Maori immersion schools in New Zealand by how strict they were about keeping English out of the classroom. And that was effective in that context because there was support in the community for Maori language, and there was it was a language that was virtually almost extinct, so that they really needed to take an active stance to protect the language. But in other cases, like in my country, in New York City, where the Puerto Rican communities and where Ofelia Garcia really came up with the idea of translanguaging, because the communities themselves already use those processes of communication through a translanguage version of Spanish and English. So in the classroom, it makes sense to also draw on those. So I think it can be, I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer about translanguaging it, but I think it can be a resource to draw on if it's appropriate in that particular context, if that's helpful.
因为刚刚问到的是关于跨领域、跨语实践 （translanguaging）， 就是现在这20年来全球非常重要的双语教育里面的一个做法，所以刚刚在整个对话里面一直在，不好意思，我做一个大学教授的补充，做一个背景。所以刚刚对话里面一直提及，就是说在很多的社会里面，它本来就是双多语社会，所以 translanguaging 对他来说是跨语言实践是很正常的语言实践的样态。但是呢，早期去看毛利语的附证的时候，毛利语是严格强调只准使用毛利语，那有它的一个社会情境的意义，在当下有它的社会情境意义，所以他特别提到说，我没有那种 one fits all， 就是说，好像是一种逻辑、一种做法可以通用于全部的这个样态。他认为很多东西是依个案而定，哈，这不好意思，我做一点点补充，因为有一些学理的东西。刚刚我看到那边有举手，来，这就是这位，对。
喂， 大家好，我稍微自我介绍一下，我是顾方怀，然后我是手语的工作者。那我在美国学的是台湾没有的 Deaf Education。那我现在刚看了演讲以后，我其实觉得我们的聋人朋友，我们的 Deaf people， 他们其实跟我们刚刚所学的这些原住民的语言一样，他们其实在一出生的时候，他们就是注定双语，而且他们不止双语，他们不止 bilingual， 他们 bicultural， 他们也 bi model。所以其实聋人的教育来说，他们其实一直生活在一个双语、双文化、双模式的一个状态之下。所以其实聋人的教育来说，他们其实有很多部分会跟教育有连结，甚至跟政策有连结。那刚刚其实在上一场的演讲里面，我们有提到政策，那这一场我们有提到很多跟教育有关的。那这些政策跟教育，其实某些时候都是跟着我们的社会的意识形态。跟我们对于这个语言的认知发展，然后才会进一步形成政策。那有的时候是政策超过我们的意识形态，或超过我们的认知。所以awareness 就是我们对于这个认知，我们对于这个意识形态。我们刚刚教授有讲到说，政策我们可以由上而下。那相反的，另外一件事情，我们可不可以由下而上，由认知、意识形态来影响政策？所以我也想请问教授，就是在他这么多的一个 project 里面，参与过的 project 里面，包括 Sammy 他们在里面，可能他们就会训练他们的学生成为 PhD， 成为一个 role model， 成为一个典范。那有没有一些他所参与过的一些project 里面呢，用什么样的方法让甚至是我们的家长，甚至我们的人民，他们能够认知，能够意识到他们自己的语言，甚至能够定位他们的文化跟历史。所以可不可以有一些譬如说范例啊等等的？
You were asking for examples of bottom-up language revitalization work, I think, by parents and other community members that complements or that, in addition to top-down policy initiatives. And yes, I definitely agree with you on that. There should, that one of the points I was trying to make is that it isn't just top-down policy. It has to take, it has to be, the spaces have to be filled with the community members, the teachers, the learners actually using and implementing the language. And examples of such bottom-up practices, I think my work is mostly about such examples. So I'm not sure if I understand your question very well, but I can point to examples in both in Peru and Bolivia and Brazil, in the Sami case. I think there are many, many examples of educators really seeking, either educators or parents in some cases, seeking to make real the use of the languages in the classrooms.
Hi, 以前他说有太多的东西，他其实想不起一个很特殊的某一个特殊的人，那说不定等一下会后可以来交流一下哈，因为他很多宝啊，因为他做了50年的语言扶正哈。那刚刚我看到那边举手。
好，我想你行業咪要上啦，哈，所以我來提張問題哈，睇下教授嘅 PPT 地位哈，講到而家概念按照語言到上任哈，language and the voice 哈，我是想語言到上任到底有乜嘅目標咯？做得教授早來講一下麼？哈，因為我去到啲當做意思啦，哈，聽一點是係講，假使語言到上任，有幾目標嘅地方，教授做得對，台灣嘅 语言还有台湾的声音，呢两部分，咱做在做嘛解么？吼，你提一点，第二点是讲，睇下有你 PPT 底部讲，家中的你少数民族的语言强下，该线上强下，就像你共备课程那样，该不种冇强弱的少数民族的语言强下，该记得用办去沟通，用办去做，是像台湾咧有河洛话，有客家话，有咧闽东语嘛，做得冇强弱的语言强下，来强下做嘛个事情么？好是吗？
So the first part of your question was about language and voice and how to differentiate them. I think what I'm trying to say there is that voice is more individual. It's the expression of meaning and identity that one voices through their, it can be through their language or through, it can even be through a majority language, but it's voice that expresses one's own meanings, one's own identity. And this was what I was trying to give the example there from this, using the concept of voice that Bakhtin had developed. The idea that when one is communicating with others and in an environment that one understands and can relate to, you can express yourself with your voice. You can be heard, but the language itself is not, what am I saying? So to take an active, I mentioned several features of voice, the taking of an active stance, the meaning making, the being in dialogue with your environment. Those are things that allow you to express your meanings for yourself that are part of your voice, which is going beyond the language that you used. It's actually conveying meaning, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So the second part of your question was, do you remember the second part? So that was fascinating to me, the example I gave you of the Brazilian indigenous educators who did speak different languages, but they found ways, they also shared certain experiences. And the same would be true in Taiwan, even though you have different language communities, there are certain shared experiences, like the history of the Japanese occupation or whatever. There can be inter-ethnic experiences that communicate across language communities. There can also be modes of communication. In this case, it was their geometric drawings that are not language specific. They're not tied to the spoken language. They communicate in other ways. That could be gestures, it could be dance, it could be digital means, like the icons we use in digital communication. Those kinds of other modes of expression that allow people to communicate across languages.
不好意思，再补充一下，因为刚刚是提到的是 Bakhtin， 就是 BAKTIN Bakhtin 的那个，他用了 Bakhtin 的那个，因为俄罗斯在留二的人一定知道哈。那的语言学理论在叙述语言 voice 跟 language 之间的一个差异，他在做这样的一个解释。那我们这一场的时间，我们就在这个12点30分以前结束，就是刚刚答应大家哈。 有一个充分的一个充足的我们的午餐时间，所以也请大家我们再次热烈的掌声，谢谢 Professor Nancy Hornberger。
非常感謝你嘅佢哋示範太好，反英文教這裡研究所教授我們的鐘正成教授。Let's welcome both of you to the stage to take a group photo。我們再次熱烈掌聲獻給我們的鐘正成主任以及我們的 Nancy Hornberger 教授。非常感謝兩位。好，再次热烈掌声献给我们的钟正成教授以及 Nancy Hornberger。接下来是我们的中午用餐的时间，我们先邀请前3排的与会贵宾，我们先起立。我们看到前方有工作人员要引导你们先行来到我们的楼上来进行用餐。那么后3排的我们与会贵宾先稍坐一下。那么提醒呢，下午我们还有继续的议程要进行。如果您有要事要先离开，请把你的口译机还回到我们的服务处。好，我们现在由工作人员引导我们前3排的与会贵宾。好，我们跟着我们的工作同仁往用餐区域。接下来呢，我们的后3排的与会贵宾呢，我们的用餐地点在我们的左手边，在我的左手边，也就是你们面对舞台的右手边。待会也会有我们的同仁来进行引导。非常感谢大家今天上午的参与。那么我们请各位贵宾呢稍作休息之后，就可以移驾到我们的用餐地点。那么用餐之后呢，我们将在1点的时候带大家到台南国家美术馆的3楼欣赏食人食海马祖艺术岛的特展。我们将在1点带大家上去。那么另外呢，我们下午1点半准时开始我们下午的会议场次。非常感谢大家，我们下午见。好，现在我们与会贵宾可以到我们的舞台的左手边，也就是我的左手边来用餐。